Chapter 2699. Are you tired of living? Tianjuowen's eyes gleamed coldly as he spoke. He did not conceal the killing intent in his heart. Tianjuowen wanted to kill Nie Tian just because Nie Tian had beaten up Tian Meng. However, Tian Meng's expression was ugly. He had just said that he was not a dog, but Tianjuowen had called him a dog. This was a slap to his face. However, he did not dare to retort. He could only listen obediently. In Tianjuowen's eyes, Tian Meng was a dog. However, even if Tian Meng was a dog, he was still a dog of the Tian family. He would not allow anyone to beat him up. At this moment, everyone sensed Tianjuowen's killing intent, and couldn't help but worry for Nie Tian. There were many martial artists from the Holy Soul continent present, and they knew how powerful the Tian family was. The Tian family was one of the 3 great families in the Holy Soul Empire. Tianjuowen's grandfather was the vice dean of the Holy Soul Academy. It was not an exaggeration to say that even if Tianjuowen killed Nie Tian now, no one would dare to stop him. The Tian family's dog cannot be beaten up for no reason. Your words are so domineering. At this moment, Nie Tian smiled faintly and said playfully, "Unfortunately, it's not a threat to me. You have to tie up your dog well. If it doesn't tie up properly, it will come out and bite you. That means you are raising a mad dog. I don't care if your mad dog bites other people, but if it bites me, I will beat it up. I will beat it until it submits, until it cries, and until it calls me its master." Tianjuowen's words were fierce. Nie Tian's eyes were not filled with fear, but with a strong desire to fight. He was ready to fight Tianjuowen at any time. Upon hearing Nie Tian's words, the entire place fell deathly silent. Everyone's attention was focused on Tianjuowen. They did not know what he would do next. "Brat, do you know who you're talking to?" Tianjuowen's eyes were filled with murderous intent as he spoke coldly. His eyes were practically spitting fire. "I didn't hear anyone speak. I only heard a mad dog barking." Nie Tianling sneered and said directly. This time, he also called Tianjuowen a mad dog. Upon hearing Nie Tian's words, Tianjuowen's eyes grew grim, and his face grew so grim that it looked as if it would drip blood at any moment. His whole body trembled, and even the muscles on his face seemed to twitch. Apparently, he was extremely furious. "Brat, you're courting death." In the next moment, Tianjuowen finally could not hold it in any longer. With a loud roar, he punched out with his fist. The power of the surroundings changed instantly, as though the sky was about to collapse and the earth was about to shatter. So strong. Everyone felt Tianjuowen's aura, and their eyes trembled as they exclaimed in unison. Tianjuowen was truly terrifying. His fist actually had the power to split mountains and break rivers. It was obvious that Tianjuowen had gathered all his strength for this punch. He wanted to kill Nie Tian directly. "Do you think I'm afraid of you?" Facing Tianjuowen's punch, Nie Tian bellowed. His aura surged, and Starlight Heaven Slash appeared in his hand. He thrust his sword forward. Bang! In the blink of an eye, the sword shadow and the fist shadow collided and exploded at the same time, turning into a powerful force that surged in the air. Nie Tian and Tianjuowen's figures moved at the same time, and they retreated a few hundred meters before they steadied themselves. This was the first time they had exchanged blows, and they were evenly matched. "Huh!" Tianjuowen steadied himself, and his eyes darkened as he exclaimed in surprise. Evidently, he had not expected Nie Tian to be so powerful. Nie Tian's aura was no weaker than his. Nie Tian frowned. His expression was calm, but his heart was filled with shock. Although it was only one move, he could tell that Tianjuowen's strength was extremely terrifying. His punch contained the power of 4 different elements. Fortunately, Nie Tian had already guessed that Tianjuowen would attack him, so he had made preparations in advance. Thus, he was able to receive the punch easily. At this time, the spectators were also stunned. Their faces were full of shock, and they could not react for a long time. No one had expected that Nye Tian would not be at a disadvantage when facing Tianjuan head-on. "Young man, I didn't expect you to be so strong." Immediately afterwards, Tianjuan let out a cold laugh and fixed Nye Tian with a grim look in his eyes. "I'd like to see how strong you are today." Then, his aura surged crazily. It was obvious that he was about to reveal his true strength. "Wait!" However, at this moment, a voice suddenly rang out. Then, a figure stepped forward and stood between Nye Tian and Tianjuan. It was Feng Qi. "Who is this young man? What is he trying to do?" Feng Qi's sudden appearance surprised everyone. Looking at Nye Tian and Tianjuan, it was obvious that they were going to fight to the death. Feng Qi's sudden appearance to disrupt the situation made everyone very displeased. "Young man, who are you?" Tianjuan frowned. He scanned Feng Qi with his divine sense and felt that the latter's aura was very strange. He could not help but frown and ask, "Brother Tian, I'm just a nosy person. Please don't take it to heart." Feng Qi chuckled and said, "Actually, Brother Tian, you don't have to be so angry. Isn't it just a dog? It doesn't matter who fought. There's no need to be so calculative." "You." Tianjuan's face darkened, and he was extremely gloomy. It was obvious that Feng Qi was on Nye Tian's side. The crowd's eyes darkened as they looked at Feng Qi in surprise. Their expressions seemed to say, "You dare to meddle in the Tian family's business? Aren't you seeking death?" At this moment, the black-clothed cultivator's face was also very ugly. According to the Holy Soul Academy's rules, private fights were absolutely not allowed. However, because the one fighting was Tianjuan, he could not intervene and stop it. "Young man, you dare to meddle in my business? Are you tired of living?" Tianjuan's face turned cold, and his eyes revealed a murderous intent. He actually wanted to kill Feng Qi as well. "Brother Tian, you can talk nonsense, but you can't talk nonsense." Feng Qi smiled faintly and said, "I'm so young, and the world is so beautiful. How could I be tired of living? It's you, on the other hand, who are so irritable and look like you're tired of living." "Young man, what did you say?" Tianjuan's face darkened as he growled. His heart was about to explode from anger. "I said you're tired of living. Can't you understand human language?" Feng Qi sneered and actually rolled his eyes. He did not put Tianjuan in his eyes at all. "Little bastard, you're looking for death." This time, Tianjuan heard it very clearly. He instantly lost control of himself and with a roar, he suddenly attacked. Boom! Tianjuan struck out with his palm. It was as if there was a huge wave that appeared, causing the surrounding space to sink. However, Feng Qi frowned. Immediately after, the ardent wind spear appeared in his hand, and he directly stabbed out with it. Boom! Bang! The shadow of the spear and the palm collided. After a loud bang, the two forces simultaneously exploded and impacted the void. Feng Qi and Tianjuan's figures retreated at the same time, then stabilized themselves at the same time. In this clash, the two of them were actually equally matched, and they were evenly matched. This young man's strength is actually so strong. Seeing this scene, everyone's expression changed, and they looked at Feng Qi in shock. Feng Qi looked ordinary, and no one expected his strength to be so strong. He was not weaker than Tianjuan. That spear strike just now, he is. On the high platform, the black-robed cultivator's expression froze. He had seen some clues from Feng Qi's spear strike and cried out in his heart, "Someone from the Feng clan." In an instant, the black-robed cultivator realized that Feng Qi was from the Feng clan. Chapter 2700. The black-clothed cultivator suddenly realized that Feng Qi was a member of the Feng clan. His expression changed. He was well aware of how powerful the Feng family was in the myriad domains. It wasn't an exaggeration to say that even the dean of the Holy Soul Academy had to show some respect when he saw the patriarch of the Feng family. The Tian family was powerful, but that was only limited to the Holy Soul domain. Compared to the Feng family, they were miles apart. Teacher, you've been looking at me for so long. Is it nice? At this moment, Feng Qi suddenly turned around and stared straight at the black-clothed cultivator. He asked cold. Feng Qi's action caused everyone to be taken aback, their faces filled with astonishment. Feng Qi was originally fighting with Tianzhuo. Why did he suddenly go and provoke a teacher of the Holy Soul Academy? First he provoked Tianzhuo, then he provoked a teacher of the Holy Soul Academy. Was Feng Qi crazy? But in the next moment, something inexplicable happened. The black-clothed cultivator was shocked. Not only was he not angry, but he was also panicking. He didn't know what to do. Even if he used his toes to think, he should have figured out that Feng Qi's previous attack was for him to see. He wanted him to reveal his identity. Brat die. Right at this moment, Tianzhuo suddenly shouted. He actually attacked again. Stop. However, before the black-clothed cultivator finished speaking, the black-clothed cultivator reacted. He shouted and his figure moved. His aura burst forth like a raging wave, suppressing the surrounding space to the point that it trembled. Boom! In an instant, Tianzhuo felt a majestic pressure descend. His body suddenly swayed and he lost control of himself. He fell heavily on the ground. What are you doing? After Tianzhuo landed, he immediately stood up and roared. Although he wasn't injured, he was in a very sorry state. He was like a hedgehog that had been provoked. He wanted to stab anyone he saw. Tianzhuo never dreamed that this black-clothed cultivator would dare to attack him. Young Master Tian, this is the Holy Soul Academy, not a place to fight, the black-clothed cultivator said cold. He obviously couldn't tell Tianzhuo about Feng Qi's identity. Tianzhuo's face darkened. He suddenly felt as if there was a lump of donkey hair stuck in his chest. He couldn't swallow it, but he couldn't spit it out. How could he not see that the black-clothed cultivator was biased towards Feng Qi? The crowd was also stunned when they saw the black-clothed cultivator's actions. What exactly happened? Why did the black-clothed cultivator suddenly attack and nearly injure Tianzhuo? In fact, the black-clothed martial artist had already shown mercy. Of course, he did not dare to really hurt Tianzhuo. Ignoring Tianzhuo, the black-clad cultivator looked at Feng Qi and said with a forced smile, "All right, this matter ends here. Let's continue with the test." Sure. Feng Qi smiled faintly and took a step forward, ready to begin the test. All right, my ass. However, at this moment, Tianzhuo roared again and shouted, "If I don't kill you today, my name isn't Tianzhuo." The next moment, his figure moved. His hand formed a claw and he grabbed at Feng Qi's back. Ka! Ka! In the blink of an eye, 3 sharp beams of light appeared in the air, heading straight for Feng Qi. Upon seeing this, Nie Tian's pupils shrank as he exclaimed, "Watch out, Feng Qi! Impudent!" However, just at this moment, the black-clothed cultivator shouted and sent out a palm strike. A berserk chi appeared and shattered the 3 beams of cold light in the air. At the same time, it condensed into a hurricane that enveloped Tianzhuo. Tianzhuo didn't have time to react. He screamed and was thrown into the air by the hurricane. Then he fell heavily to the ground. After landing, Tianzhuo immediately stood up. He looked at the black-clothed cultivator with cold eyes and roared, "Why are you helping them? Young Master Tian, that's enough. Stop it now. Don't make things difficult for me." The black-clothed cultivator was a little angry at this time. Tianzhuo's face darkened. He never thought that the black-clothed cultivator would dare to reprimand him in front of so many people. At this time, everyone was stunned and looked at the scene in front of them in disbelief. No one knew what happened. Why did the black-clothed cultivator's attitude change 180 degrees in an instant? Young Master Tian, today's matter ends here. You should leave first, the black-clothed cultivator said impatiently. He didn't even want to look at Tianjuan. Tianjuan stood in the same place. His eyes were burning with anger. The black-clothed cultivator ignored him. He turned around and was ready to return to the testing platform. Bastard, who do you think you are? How dare you reprimand me? However, at this time, Tianjuan roared. His whole body moved like a wild beast, and he pounced on the black-clothed cultivator. Huh! The black-clothed cultivator frowned when he felt a strong wind behind him. He turned around and punched out. Bang! In the next moment, there was a muffled sound in the air. Tianjuan's body was sent flying. After he landed heavily on the ground, he drew a bloody trail that was tens of meters long. The black-clothed cultivator was really annoyed by Tianjuan. In his anger, he lost control of his strength and injured Tianjuan. The sudden scene caused everyone's eyes to tremble, and they sucked in a breath of cold air. Tianjuan was actually injured. In the Holy Soul Academy, Tianjuan was injured. This was a big deal. Young master. At this time, Tianmeng, who had been in a daze for a long time, finally reacted. He howled and pounced on Tianjuan. At this moment, Tianjuan stood up and slapped Tianmeng, who was charging at him. He roared, "Get out of my way! I'm fine." Tianmeng was still in midair. He felt a burning pain on one side of his face. When the black-clothed cultivator saw that Tianjuan had stood up, his tensed face relaxed. He was really scared just now. If he really beat Tianjuan up, he would be dead for sure. Tianjuan's grandfather was the vice dean of the Holy Soul Academy. He was famous for being protective of his students. Fortunately, Tianjuan was only injured and it was not a big deal. Tianjuan stood there, breathing heavily. He was like a beast trapped in a cage. Although he was very violent, he had nowhere to vent his anger. "Young Master Tian, I used too much force just now. I hope I didn't hurt you," the black-clothed cultivator said awkwardly when he saw Tianjuan's appearance. "I'll remember you. Let's wait and see," Tianjuan said coldly. His eyes were cold. He looked at Nye Tian and Feng Qi and you too. Tianjuan, will kill you." With that, Tianjuan suddenly turned around, intending to leave. "Oh, you'll kill us? I'm so scared." But at this moment, Feng Qi's voice rang out. It was very sharp, full of sarcasm and provocation. "Young Master Tian, have you forgotten? You just said that if you don't kill me today, your name isn't Tianjuan. I'm standing here fine. Young Master Tian, are you going to change your name? What should I change my name? How about Mad Dog Tian? It's domineering enough and suits your temperament. What do you think?" The mocking words were like steel needles stabbing into Tianjuan's heart. The crowd was dumbfounded. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. If Feng Qi's target wasn't Tianjuan, the crowd would have laughed. But even so, there were a few people in the crowd who couldn't help but laugh. Tianjuan stood there. His eyes were bloodshot. Every inch of his flesh and every bone in his body was trembling. Chapter 2701. Chapter 2701. Chapter 2701. Demi-Saint Heavenly Arise. As soon as Feng Qi's voice trailed off, the scene fell into a dead silence. Everyone in the square was watching, but no one dared to make a sound. Everyone's eyes were fixed on Tianjuan, not knowing what he would do next. Tianjuan had always been treated like a god since he was young, so he had never been humiliated like this before. His eyes were filled with murderous intent, and his anger surged in the air. Everyone could feel Tianjuan's monstrous anger, which was like a volcanic eruption. But in the end, Tianjuan did not make a move and forcefully endured it. He was about to bite his tongue off. "Let's wait and see." Tianjuan's eyes were extremely cold as he spoke in a hoarse voice. After saying that, he turned around and left. "Mad Dog Tian, why are you in such a hurry to leave?" But once again, Feng Qi's voice rang out provocatively. "I know you hate me very much. Why don't I give you a chance to take revenge? Let's make a bet." What bet? Tianjuan's body froze as he spoke coldly, but he did not turn around. It's a simple bet. We'll bet on the Sacred Soul Tablet test to see whose talent is higher and who will be recognized by the Sacred Soul Tablet more. Feng Qi smiled faintly and said in a clear voice. Tianjuan's blood-red eyes narrowed when he heard Feng Qi's words, and his entire body froze. At the next moment, the surrounding crowd went into an uproar and started discussing among themselves. Is this guy crazy? He's betting on the Sacred Soul Tablet test with Tianjuan. Tianjuan's test is over. Triggering the Sacred Soul Tablet to release a red pillar of light is the highest talent. Isn't this guy asking for trouble by betting with him? This kid has guts and personality. I like it. Everyone was discussing, thinking that Feng Qi had gone crazy. But Feng Qi's current state was more normal than normal. He had a faint smile on his face, and he was very happy. Kid, is what you said true? At this moment, Tianjuan could no longer hold back. He suddenly turned around and looked at Feng Qi. His eyes revealed an unconcealable fanaticism. He could almost see the scene of Feng Qi's crushing defeat. He had already finished his test, and the result was so shocking that it even caused a sensation in the audience. Feng Qi's strength was not bad, but his talent was definitely below his. At least, that was what Tianjuan thought. Of course it's real. Feng Qi smiled faintly, but then he looked at Nie Tian and said, however, the person who bet with you isn't me. It's my friend. Is that him? Tianjuan was stunned, and the gaze he shot at Nie Tian was vicious and ruthless. He wished for nothing more than to skin Nie Tian alive. He hated Feng Qi, but he hated Nie Tian even more. All of this had happened because of Nie Tian. If Tianjuan had to choose between Feng Qi and Nie Tian for revenge, he would definitely choose Nie Tian. More importantly, he felt that Nie Tian's strength was not as good as Feng Qi, so his talent should also be below Feng Qi's. Feng Qi letting Nie Tian bet with Tianjuan was exactly what Tianjuan wanted. Huh! Nie Tian couldn't help but be stunned when he heard Feng Qi's words. The corner of his mouth raised into a bitter smile. Feng Qi was in the limelight, so why drag him into it? Nie Tian, it's up to you this time. At this moment, Feng Qi transmitted his voice over. He chuckled and said, your talent is above mine. You can definitely beat him. Nie Tian was speechless. It seemed that he had no choice but to bet on this bet. The truth was that Feng Qi had long since planned to let Nie Tian take the bet. Deep down, he was convinced that Nie Tian was more talented than he was. If Nie Tian couldn't beat Tianjuan, then Feng Qi would lose even more miserably. At this moment, the eyes of the crowd became heated. Obviously, they wanted to watch a good show. Do you dare to bet with me, boy? At this moment, Tianjuan's frustration was completely gone. He took a step forward and looked at Nie Tian with a fierce look in his eyes. Why wouldn't I? Nie Tianling said, chuckling coldly, his eyes flickering with disdain. Feng Qi had already pushed him forward, so there was no way he could back down. Besides, Nie Tian was convinced that he shouldn't lose to Tianjuan, considering his talent. When the onlookers heard Nie Tian's words, strange expressions appeared on their faces. Even though Nie Tian had shown that he wasn't weak, he was still only a peak paramount god. Most of the onlookers could tell that Tianjuan hadn't used his full strength in his first attack. Therefore, they felt that Nie Tian's battle prowess was definitely below Tianjuan's. Most importantly, Tianjuan had already activated the red pillar of light from the Saint Soul Steel, which represented the highest level of talent. Under such circumstances, why would Nie Tian take the bet with Tianjuan? Where did he get the courage to take the bet with Tianjuan? In the eyes of the onlookers, Nie Tian wasn't a fool, but a madman. Very well. Tianjuan sneered when he saw that Nie Tian had agreed to the bet. You brat, I'll make you kneel at my feet and beg for mercy later. Before Nie Tian could say anything, Feng Qi said with a cold smile, Young Master Tian, Nye Tian hasn't started the Saint Soul test yet. Don't you think it's too early for you to fart? Tian Zhuowen looked coldly at Feng Qi and said coldly, "There's no need to use your sharp tongue. You'll be crying later." "I was born eloquent. Why do you care?" Feng Qi smiled and raised his eyebrows. He then said provocatively, "Let's talk about the bet." "Sure. What do you want to bet?" Tian Zhuowen sneered arrogantly. "Since there are so many onlookers here, we should make the bet bigger." The corner of Feng Qi's mouth twitched. "Young Master Tian, what's the most valuable thing you have on you?" Tian Zhuowen was stunned for a moment. His eyes flashed with malice. He then flipped his palm and a scroll appeared in his hand. Without further ado, he opened the scroll. A powerful aura of a formation was released, instantly enveloping the space within a few thousand meters. "What a powerful formation aura!" the onlookers exclaimed as they felt the aura of the formation in the air. The formation scroll in Tian Zhuowen's hand was of a very high grade, and its aura was extremely vigorous. The aura of this spell formation seems to be used to gather divine power. If I practice cultivation in this spell formation, my cultivation speed will definitely increase by a lot, Nye Tian thought to himself after sensing the aura of the spell formation. That was when Fat Cat exclaimed in surprise. "It's actually a demi-saint formation scroll. Is this scroll very powerful?" Nye Tian's eyes narrowed when he saw that Fat Cat had spoken. "I wouldn't say it's powerful, but it's not bad." Fat Cat smiled faintly. Once this formation scroll is opened, it would instantly absorb divine energy within a 10,000-meter radius. A martial artist training within the formation scroll would be 10 times faster than outside. So powerful! Nye Tian's eyes trembled when he heard Fat Cat's words. To be able to increase one's cultivation speed by more than 10 times was inconceivable in Nye Tian's eyes. No wonder Tian Zhuowen's ability had reached the pinnacle of God tier at such a young age. It turned out that he had such a heaven-defying item. At the moment, everyone else was staring at the formation scroll in Tian Zhuowen's hand. Their eyes were also burning with greed that they could hardly conceal. "What do you think? Not bad, right?" Tian Zhuowen smiled faintly and looked at Feng Qi provocatively. Chapter 2702. Fortunately, it was not him. Feng Qi sneered and promptly unfurled the scroll in his hand. At once, a frightening force of suppression surged out violently, shrouding the space within tens of thousands of meters. At that very moment, everyone could feel the frightening force of suppression that was almost suffocating. Some of the weaker martial artists were actually unable to withstand the tremendous force of suppression and directly vomited blood. "That's a suppression scroll." The martial artists of the Saint Soul Academy could feel the frightening force of suppression, their eyes flinching and their faces full of shock. He was already a demi-saint pinnacle, and yet he could not even breathe under the pressure of that force of suppression. One could well imagine how powerful that suppression seal was. "That's—" Nye Tian's eyes narrowed when he saw the scroll in Feng Qi's hand, and his expression changed abruptly. He immediately remembered that the scroll in Feng Qi's hand was a demi-saint suppression seal that could instantly suppress a demi-saint. Back at the Shadow Mountain, Feng Qi had used that scroll to help Nye Tian slay the Bloodwing Patriarch, one of the 13 sky coffins of the ghoul corpses. And Nye Tian knew very well how powerful the suppression seal was. As long as he had that scroll, Feng Qi would be able to stand against a demi-saint. However, the suppression seal would need to recharge its power after each use, and it would take a long time. "Young Master Tian, do you feel it? My suppression seal is not inferior to your divine formation scroll, is it?" Feng Qi said provocatively, waving his hand and withdrawing the suppression seal scroll. "That suppression seal scroll is certainly frightening. If you were to encounter a powerful foe, opening the scroll in an instant would be enough to reverse life and death." Everyone nodded and discussed. "All right, I agree to your wager with the suppression seal scroll." Tianjuan's lips curled into a smile after he had personally experienced the power of the suppression seal scroll. In his opinion, this bet was a sure win for him. Hence, this suppression seal scroll was given to him by Feng Qi. Nie Tian furrowed his brows and bitterly smiled. He thought to himself, it seems like this bet is too big. If I lose, I'll suffer a huge loss. He didn't expect Feng Qi to play this big. To be honest, Nie Tian was confident in himself, but not completely. On the other hand, Feng Qi had a confident look on his face. Where did his confidence come from? Since the bet has been decided, let's begin. Tianjuan smiled cold. He couldn't wait any longer. Hold it. Feng Qi sneered as he looked at Tianjuan with a strange expression. Brat, are you going back on your word? Tianjuan's face darkened as he growled. Do I look like someone who would go back on his word? Feng Qi smiled faintly and said, I just feel that this isn't enough. It's too boring. Huh. Tianjuan's face darkened. He said cold, what else do you want to bet? How about this? You and my friend Nie Tian, whoever loses will shout, I'm a stupid pig 3 times in front of everyone. Also, the loser will have to bark like a dog 3 times when he sees the winner. How about it? Feng Qi smiled faintly and the corners of his mouth curled up into a smug smile. This. When everyone heard Feng Qi's words, they all gasped. Their expressions were very strange. They had to admit that Feng Qi's game wasn't boring. However, it was a little too big and too ruthless. Humiliating him in front of so many people and asking him to bark like a dog in the future. Only Feng Qi could come up with such a rotten idea. Nie Tian frowned and couldn't help but pout. His expression was very ugly. If he knew that Feng Qi was playing this big, he wouldn't have agreed to this bet. If they were to lose this time, it would be a complete disgrace to their grandmother's house. Nie Tian, are you all right? Feng Qi smiled faintly and looked at Nie Tian confidently. No problem, Nie Tian replied, forcing a faint smile onto his face. At this time, he had to answer even if he had a question. Young Master Tian, seeing how confident you are, there shouldn't be any problems, right? Feng Qi smiled faintly as he looked at Tianjuan. Tianjuan's face darkened. At this moment, he was actually a little hesitant. He was originally very confident. However, Feng Qi increased the stakes bit by bit and he suddenly lost his confidence. He could afford to lose the Heavenly Array Scroll. However, calling him a stupid pig and barking like a dog was too shameful. Young Master Tian, what if you are scared? We don't have to bet on this. It's up to you. Feng Qi looked at Tianjuan and laughed. His tone was very provocative and made everyone want to punch him. I bet. Tianjuan was enraged by Feng Qi's provocation. He roared in anger. Okay. Feng Qi smiled faintly and said, since young Master Tian has made the bet, then everyone here will be the witness. Or else, if young Master Tian breaks his promise and goes back on his words, I will be at a great disadvantage. Okay. We will all be the witnesses. Everyone agreed in unison. After all, they were just here to watch the show. Okay, then let's begin. Feng Qi smiled faintly and turned to Nie Tian. Don't be in such a hurry. Let me test it first and see what this Saint Soul monument is capable of. Then, Feng Qi's silhouette flashed and he stepped onto the testing platform. Why is that guy up there? Everyone was taken aback and puzzled when they saw Feng Qi suddenly stepping onto the platform. Nie Tian smiled faintly. It was good that Feng Qi was tested first, since he could observe the Saint Soul monument. Brat, you are so arrogant. I would like to see how talented you are. Tianjuan looked at Feng Qi and said with a cold heart. Everyone's eyes were slightly heated as they were looking forward to Feng Qi's performance. Please. The black-clothed martial artist on the platform was very respectful and even cautious. Just now, Feng Qi had taken out a demi-saint suppressive seal scroll, which convinced him that Feng Qi was a member of the Feng family and held a very high position there. He naturally had to be very cautious when dealing with someone from the Feng family. Feng Qi nodded and stared at the Saint Soul monument with a burning gaze. His lips curled into a smile as he focused his energy on his palm and struck out. Pft! The shadow of the palm whizzed out and sank directly into the monument, causing it to shake a little. Everyone's eyes were abruptly heated at that moment as they looked forward to what would happen next. Boom! In the next instant, a beam of light shot out from the Saint Soul monument. It was several meters long and as red as fire. It was extremely blinding. A crimson beam. The scene before them made everyone's eyes tremble as they cried out in surprise. Feng Qi had actually triggered the crimson beam of the Saint Soul monument. Huh! Tianzhuowen's eyes darkened and his expression became extremely gloomy. On the other hand, Nie Tian's reaction was very normal. The outcome before him was within his expectations. Feng Qi was a person who possessed the fifth other pupil, so his talent was certainly not weak. Everyone's eyes were trembling as they stared at the crimson beam without blinking. The crimson beam lasted for a full 5 seconds before it shook a little and slowly disappeared. The black-clothed martial artist was stunned and speechless. Feng Qi's talent was far beyond what he had expected. By the time the crimson beam disappeared, Tianzhuowen was already drenched in cold sweat, clearly quite frightened. Chapter 2703. Martial Path Fate. Tianzhuowen was dumbfounded when he saw the Saint Spirit Light Pillar triggered by Feng Qi. He was glad that the person who had made the bet with him was Nie Tian and not Feng Qi. If it had been Feng Qi, Tianzhuowen would have lost the bet. Although Tianzhuowen and Feng Qi had both activated the Sacred Soul Stone Tablet's Scarlet Light Pillar, Feng Qi's Scarlet Light Pillar was brighter and brighter, and it lasted longer. Obviously, Feng Qi's talent was above Tianzhuowen's. Oh my god, another person has triggered the Martial Path Fate array. The cultivator in black exclaimed in shock. As far as he knew, anyone who could trigger the Saint Spirit Stone Tablet's red light pillar could trigger the Martial Path Fate array behind the Saint Spirit Stone Tablet. Rumor had it that the cultivators who could trigger the Martial Path Fate array were people who could fight against the heavens for their lives. Their talent was so strong that it could shock the heavens and earth. The cultivator in black did not expect Feng Qi's talent to be even stronger than Tianzhuowen's. It was rare for two cultivators to trigger the Martial Path Fate array in the Saint Soul Academy on the same day. The crowd below the stage was stunned as well. They stared at Feng Qi in shock, unable to react for a long time. However, Feng Qi's expression was stiff, and it could even be said to be extremely ugly. He was filled with regret. If he had known that his talent was so strong, he would not have let Nie Tian and Tianzhuowen make the bet. Unfortunately, Feng Qi did not have confidence in himself, which was why he let Nie Tian make the bet. Motherf ****. Feng Qi froze for a few seconds before he finally exploded. He could not wait to smash the Saint Spirit Stone Tablet in front of him with a roar. It was too late to say anything now. He could only rely on Nie Tian now. Feng Qi blurred into action and landed beside Nie Tian, a helpless look on his face. Trust me. Nie Tian patted Feng Qi's shoulder and comforted him with a faint smile. Then, just as Nie Tian was about to step onto the platform, someone else stepped onto the platform before him. Ao Qing. Nie Tian's gaze focused, and when he saw the figure on the test platform clearly, he couldn't help but shake his head and smile. Jun Aoqing clearly wanted Nie Tian to observe the Saint Soul Tablet more, so she chose to do the test before Nie Tian. Who is this person? Why are you snatching it at this time? Everyone looked at Jun Aoqing speechlessly, clearly unhappy. Now, everyone was looking forward to the bet between Nie Tian and Tianzhuowen. Jun Aoqing went up to take the test, and everyone was impatient. However, Jun Aoqing ignored everyone else and took a step forward. She struck out with her palm, and the palm's shadow sank into the Saint Soul Tablet. At this time, everyone had an impatient look on their faces, and they were not even in the mood to watch. My God, it's a scarlet light pillar. However, at this time, a voice suddenly screamed, and the expression on the person's face was extremely shocked. It really is a scarlet light pillar. Everyone reacted and exclaimed in unison. No one had expected that the ordinary-looking June Ouching could actually trigger a scarlet light pillar. Under countless horrified gazes, the scarlet light pillar maintained for 3 to 4 seconds, and then gradually disappeared. This, after a long time, everyone gasped, and the shock in their hearts was written on their faces. The cultivator in black on the test platform was completely dumbfounded. He stood there like a stone pillar, and his mouth was wide open, but no sound came out. The third person to trigger the Marshall Path Destiny Array had appeared. If he had not seen it with his own eyes, the cultivator in black would not have dared to believe the scene in front of him. Within a single day, 3 people had consecutively touched the Marshall Path Fate Grid Grand Array. In the history of Saint Soul Academy, this was perhaps the first of its kind. The scarlet light pillar triggered by June Ouching was slightly weaker than Feng Qi's, but stronger than Tianzhuowen's. This meant that June Ouching's talent was above Tianzhuowen's, and below Feng Qi's. At the same time that June Ouching triggered the scarlet light pillar, at the most mysterious place of Saint Soul Academy, the main hall of the Heavenly Star Pavilion. Above the dark main hall, there were specks of light floating in midair, as though they were stars hanging in the night sky. Upon closer inspection, those floating specks of light were actually enveloped in a large array. The large array wasn't big, and was only a kilometer in circumference. It was a huge sphere that floated above the main hall. This Grand Array was Saint Soul Academy's most famous Martial Dao Fate Grand Array. There had always been a legend about cultivators. Powerful cultivators had the talent to communicate with heaven and earth, and contain the Tao of heaven and earth. The Tao of heaven and earth in a cultivator's body was the Martial Path Destiny. Not everyone had a Martial Path Destiny, and only the most talented cultivators could possibly have a Martial Path Destiny. The Martial Path Destiny Array was actually a large array that was created by imitating the Tao of heaven and earth. Furthermore, the Martial Path Destiny Array was connected to all the Saint Soul Stone tablets, so as long as a cultivator had a Martial Path Destiny, it would be reflected on the Martial Path Destiny Array. The specks of light in the large array represented those who had a Martial Path Destiny Array. Every speck of light represented a cultivator with a Martial Path Destiny. At this moment, an old man stood outside the Martial Path Destiny Array with a shocked expression on his face. His gaze was focused on the 3 specks of light that had just appeared, and his old face was completely lifeless. He had never expected that 3 cultivators with Martial Path Destiny would appear in such a short period of time. Furthermore, the specks of light on their Martial Path Destiny were very bright, and it was obvious that they were exceptional geniuses. Ha 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 ha! After a long time, the old man let out a strange laugh and exclaimed, I never thought that I, Bien Hongnong, would be able to see so many cultivators with Martial Path Destiny appear at the same time in my lifetime. This is a grand occasion for my Saint Soul Academy. The old man was called Bien Hongnong, and he was the pavilion master of the Saint Soul Academy's Starry Sky Pavilion. Bien Hongnong had been responsible for guarding the Starry Sky Pavilion for more than 100,000 years, and this was the first time he had seen 3 Martial Path Destiny appear at the same time. How could he not be excited? Quick, I have to inform the dean immediately. Bien Hongnong calmed down and shouted excitedly. He directly released a stream of divine sense to inform the dean of the Saint Soul Academy. On the other side, in the Saint Soul Square, Ouching has integrated with the Dragon Spring Vein, and she also has the Netherworld Ghost Vein in her body, so it's not surprising that she can trigger the Scarlet Light Pillar. Nie Tian looked at June Ouching and faintly smiled. At this moment, Nie Tian's confidence was greatly boosted. Because he had participated in the path to heaven with June Ouching, and even entered the door of the Ghost Emperor with her, His performance in all aspects was better than June Ouching's. If there was no problem with the Saint's Soul Tablet, the light pillar triggered by Nie Tian should be stronger than June Ouching's and Feng Qi's. June Ouching faintly smiled, and with a flash, she landed beside Nie Tian. Seeing this scene, Tian Zhuowen couldn't help but feel a strong jealousy in his heart. June Ouching's beauty was enough to topple cities, and her talent was peerless, but she was following beside Nie Tian, which made Tian Zhuowen very uncomfortable. In his opinion, a girl like June Ouching should be by his side. "Kid, it's your turn." At this moment, Tian Zhuowen sneered, and directly stared at Nie Tian and shouted, "I know." Nie Tian faintly smiled, and with a flash, he directly stepped onto the testing platform. Everyone's eyes followed Nie Tian closely, without blinking, for fear of missing something. Everyone saw that Feng Qi and June Ouching were people around Nie Tian, and it seemed that Nie Tian was the leader. As the saying goes, birds of a feather flock together. Since Feng Qi and June Ouching were so talented, Nie Tian's talent wouldn't be bad either. Chapter 2704. 7 colored ripples under the watchful eyes of countless people, Nie Tian stepped onto the Saint's Soul testing platform. Tian Zhuowen's eyes were cold as he stared at Nie Tian. He said, "Brat, I'll let you shine for a while. You'll be crying later." Feng Qi and June Ouching's Saint's Soul testing had shocked Tian Zhuowen. However, he did not believe that Nie Tian's talent would be so terrifying. Nie Tian stood on the testing platform and stared at the Saint's Soul Stone Tablet. He thought to himself, the Saint's Soul Stone Tablet tests a cultivator's overall potential. Not only am I a God-fiend origin fetus cultivator, but I also have a primal star stone in my body. It's not too much for me to be able to produce a 10-meter red pillar of light. Just now, the red pillars of light that Feng Qi and the others had produced were several meters tall. Nie Tian thought that if he could create a pillar of crimson light that was 10 meters tall, he would definitely defeat Tian Zhuowen. "Make your move," the black-clad cultivator nodded slightly as he looked at Nie Tian. Because of Feng Qi and June Ouching, the black-clad cultivator was very polite to Nie Tian. Nie Tian nodded and smiled faintly. He took a deep breath and gathered some energy in his palm. Then, he struck out with his palm. Puff! The shadow of the palm whistled through the air. The instant it touched the Holy Spirit stone tablet, it disappeared into it. At this moment, everyone's eyes suddenly trembled. Their nerves were stretched to the extreme, and their hearts were in their throats. This was the moment that would decide the outcome of this bet. Everyone was very excited. However, what happened next was something that no one had expected. After the Saint's Soul Stone Tablet absorbed Nie Tian's palm, it did not react at all. It remained motionless, as if nothing had happened. Everyone's eyes trembled. They were all dumbfounded, not knowing what was going on. Just now, everyone had seen Nie Tian's attack. He was very strong. Moreover, Nie Tian was very young, and his martial arts talent was definitely monstrous. There was no reason for him not to trigger the sacred soul steel's radiance with his palm strike. However, this unreasonable thing actually happened. Countless pairs of eyes stared at the sacred soul stone tablet, as if they wanted to force a pillar of light out of the sacred soul stone tablet. 1 second passed. 5 seconds passed. 10 seconds passed. There was still no reaction from the Saint's Soul Tablet. What's going on? Everyone was confused, unable to believe what they were seeing. If Nie Tian had only shot out green or cyan beams of light, everyone could have believed it. However, he had not shot out any beams of light at all. This was not right. The black-clothed warriors of Holy Spirit Academy were also stupefied by the scene in front of them. It took a long time for them to react, and they cried out in surprise. Feng Qi and June Ouching were even more embarrassed. They were speechless. Nie Tian stood on the testing platform. His face was tense and his eyebrows were furrowed. He did not know what was going on. Ha 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 ha! Just at this moment, a shrill laughter rang out. It was Tianjuan. As if he had gone mad, he laughed and said, "There's nothing, there's nothing." He pointed at Nye Tian and screamed, "You didn't even shoot out the weakest purple beam of light. You're a piece of trash through and through." His arrogant and mocking voice caused everyone to be stunned. However, Nye Tian did not care about Tianjuan. He knew that something must have gone wrong. "Ha ha ha, ha ha ha, I won, I won." At this moment, Tianjuan seemed to have gone mad as he screamed and shouted. Everyone looked at Tianjuan with complicated expressions, not knowing what to say. Looking at the current situation, Tianjuan had indeed won. Bam! However, just as Tianjuan was about to go crazy with joy, the Holy Spirit steel suddenly shook. Then, a beam of light appeared and shot up into the sky. It was 10 meters long. "Look!" Everyone was startled by this sudden scene, and they immediately cried out in alarm as they looked at the huge beam of light. The moment they saw this giant beam of light, everyone's expression froze. The light that they saw was not scarlet, nor was it any other color. It was blazing white, like a white dragon floating in the air, releasing a scorching and dazzling halo. This! Everyone gasped. They were completely dumbfounded. They had no idea what was going on. The Holy Spirit steel would emit light when testing, but it only emitted 7 colors: red, orange, yellow, green, cyan, blue, and purple. What was with this white beam of light? At this moment, Nye Tian was also dumbfounded, and his face went blank. A blazing white pillar of light that was dozens of meters long. This was something that he had never imagined. Hence, everyone's expression was blank as they stared at the white beam of light in the air. This blazing white pillar of light lasted for several minutes. Bam! Just when everyone's eyes were a little tired from watching, the blazing white pillar of light suddenly shook, and then exploded, forming layers of halos in the air, like ripples surging out. Everyone was completely shocked by the scene in front of them. Their eyes were wide open, afraid that they would miss something. There were 7 layers of halos, corresponding to the 7 colors: red, orange, yellow, green, cyan, blue, and purple. They were like a rainbow, surging in the air. At the same time, it was like layers upon layers of blooming lotuses, colorful and dazzling. At this moment, everyone felt like they were in a dream. The 7 colored ripples in the air slowly dispersed and only disappeared after a long time. However, everyone's expression was still dull, and they could not react for a long time. Everything that happened in front of them was beyond their understanding. They had no idea what was going on. Nye Tian stood on the test platform and was stunned for more than 10 seconds. Finally, he reacted and murmured, "Did I win or lose?" When everyone heard Nye Tian's words, they reacted one after another. Their faces were dull and filled with doubt. The white beam of light triggered by Nye Tian was extremely shocking, especially the scene of the 7 colored ripples when it exploded at the end. It was so beautiful that it was like a dream. However, the white beam of light and the 7 colored ripples were beyond the scope of everyone's understanding. Now, no one knew whether the beam of light triggered by Nye Tian was stronger or weaker than the red beam of light. In terms of the degree of shock and beauty, Nye Tian won. However, at this moment, Nye Tian and Tianjuan were competing in terms of talent, so it was hard to say who would win. Just as Nye Tian triggered the 7 colored ripples, at the same time, in the main hall of the Holy Soul Academy's Starry Sky Pavilion, the 2 figures stared at the martial Tao Fate matrix array in the air above the hall with dazed expressions. They stood there like 2 blocks of wood. Their gazes were all locked onto a spot of light that was radiating in all directions. That spot of light had just appeared, but the light it emitted was brighter and brighter than any of the other spots of light. It was simply blinding, illuminating the entire Martial Path Fate matrix array. Bien Hongnong, is this also a Martial Path Fate array light spot of a martialist? After a long time, one of the figures calmed down and asked the Starry Sky Pavilion Master, Bien Hongnong. This figure was a weathered old man. His face was as calm as still water, and his aura was restrained. However, the aura that was about to burst out could not be concealed. He stood there like a towering mountain, giving people a deep sense of what it meant to be unattainable and unfathomable. Chapter 2705. Heavenly Star Doomsday Didin. I don't know. Bien Hongnong looked at the largest light spot with a dumbfounded expression. Even his voice was trembling. He had been guarding the Heavenly Star Pavilion for more than 100,000 years and had never seen such a bright martial path fate light spot. He had never seen a light spot that was half as bright as this. He could not imagine how powerful a person's martial path fate light spot must be to produce such a terrifying martial path fate light spot. If this is the martial Dao fate light of a martial artist, then the strength of this person's martial Dao fate light can be said to be shocking. Dean Saint's soul was also very shocked at this moment. His eyes trembled slightly as if he had thought of something. In his memory, the person with the strongest martial path fate light spot in the history of Saint Soul Academy was Nie Fenghua, who possessed the God-binding fetus. However, Nie Fenghua's martial path fate light spot was several times dimmer than the martial path fate light spot in front of him. If he had not seen it with his own eyes, Dean Saint's soul would not have believed that someone's martial path fate light spot could be this powerful. He could feel that the martial path fate light spot in front of him had already affected the entire martial path fate array. It seemed like the legend of martial path fate light spot might be true. If a martialist's martial path fate light spot was powerful enough, they could influence the Tao of heaven and earth. Huh! Just as Dean Saint's soul was in shock, Bien Hongnong's expression became strange, as though he had discovered something extraordinary. His eyes were trembling with excitement, and even his body was swaying slightly. Bien Hongnong, what's wrong? Dean Saint's soul suddenly realized that Bien Hongnong's expression was strange. He could not help but frown and ask. Although Dean Saint's soul's strength was far superior to Bien Hongnong's, the latter's research on martial path fate light spot was far superior. Therefore, if something happened in the martial path fate array, Dean Saint's soul might not be able to tell even if Bien Hongnong could. Dean, look carefully. Is this martial path fate light spot emitting light? Bien Hongnong sucked in a breath of cold air, and his face was filled with extreme shock. His teeth were chattering incessantly, and his words were stuttering. Huh! Dean Saint's soul's eyes narrowed slightly. Then, he spread out his divine sense and carefully sensed the martial path fate light. This. The moment his divine sense locked onto the martial path fate light. Dean Saint's soul's pupils suddenly shrank, and his old face stiffened. He really discovered that the martial path fate light spot was constantly releasing light in all directions. It was like layers of halos, and although it looked very weak, it had an effect on the entire martial path fate array. Dean Xinghun and Bien Hongnong were both very shocked. They had never seen such a situation before. They were stunned on the spot and couldn't say anything for a long time. But then, an even stranger scene happened. Boom! 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 Suddenly, the martial Dao fate matrix light. Began to release a violent light. Under the impact of the light beams, the entire martial Dao fate matrix array began to shake violently. In the blink of an eye, the martial path fate. Shone brightly, overshadowing all the other martial path fate. In the entire martial path fate matrix array, only this martial path fate matrix light. Could be seen. It was as if it was the absolute ruler of this world. Bien Hongnong, what's going on? Dean Saint's soul's eyes were trembling, and he couldn't hide the trembling in his voice. He was the dean of the Saint Soul Academy, a top powerhouse of the Saint Soul region. Even he had such a reaction, which showed how shocked he was. Dean, I don't know either. Bien Hongnong was even more shocked than Dean Saint Soul. He had been guarding the martial path fate matrix array for hundreds of thousands of years, but he had never seen such a situation. Bien Hongnong could vaguely sense that something big was about to happen. Boom, boom, boom. Following that, the martial path fate matrix light dot did not calm down. Instead, it released rays of light even more violently. It was like layers of energy waves that surged in the space and attacked the entire martial path fate matrix array. Following this, the martial path fate matrix array shook more and more violently. In the end, even the Starry Sky Pavilion's main hall began to shake as if it was going to collapse at any time. Bien Hongnong, what's going on? If this goes on, will the martial path fate matrix array be able to hold on? Dean Saint Soul frowned and asked in a cold voice. I don't know either. Bien Hongnong had never seen such a situation before. His face was extremely embarrassed, and his tongue was tied. Boom, boom, boom. At that moment, the martial path fate matrix array shook even more violently and emitted a series of explosions, as if it was going to collapse at any time. The Starry Sky Pavilion's main hall was also shaking like a small boat in the middle of a storm. Bien Hongnong, quickly think of something. Dean Saint Soul shouted with a gloomy expression. All right, I'll think of something, Bien Hongnong nodded repeatedly, but his expression was extremely awkward. He had never encountered a situation like this, so he had no idea what to do. Phew! In the next moment, Bien Hongnong took a deep breath and forced himself to calm down. After that, a formation scroll appeared in his hand, and he directly opened it. Strands of formation intent surged out violently and charged into the martial path fate formation with the intention of stabilizing it. Bang! However, this caused the light dot to become even more violent, and it suddenly emitted an extremely violent light. Instantly, layers of light rippled out and turned into energy waves that crashed into the martial path fate matrix array. Bang! Bang bang bang! At that instant, the martial path fate matrix array finally could not hold on any longer. It shook violently, and then countless cracks appeared on the array. Bien Hongnong was stunned by the scene before him. He was completely dumbfounded, and his mouth was wide open, but no sound came out. Oh no! Leave! Dean Saint Soul's expression darkened as he realized something. He let out a low roar, grabbed Bien Hongnong, and dashed out of the Starry Sky Pavilion's main hall like a ray of light. Rumble! Walala! Just as Dean Saint Soul and Bien Hongnong dashed out of the main hall, the entire main hall shook violently and collapsed instantly. Huge rocks were sent flying, and waves of soil shot up into the sky. Dean Saint Soul's expression was gloomy as he watched the main hall of the Starry Sky Pavilion turn into a pile of ruins, but there was nothing he could do. It's over, it's over. Bien Hongnong stared at the towering turbid waves in front of him for more than 10 seconds before he reacted and burst into tears. He was the pavilion leader of the Starry Sky Pavilion, and had guarded the martial path fate matrix array for hundreds of thousands of years. Now that he had witnessed the martial path fate matrix array and the main hall of the Starry Sky Pavilion being reduced to ruins, the pain in his heart was unbearable. He had never thought that the indestructible martial path fate matrix array would be destroyed in such a manner. Bien Hongnong originally thought that the appearance of several light dots would be an exciting moment, but he did not expect that such a moment would become the doomsday of the Starry Sky Pavilion. Dean Saint Soul was also extremely pained when he saw the scene in front of him. However, he could still maintain his composure and did not lose his composure. After a long time, the turbid waves in the sky finally dissipated, and the originally majestic Starry Sky Pavilion was now a pile of rubble. Who the hell is this person? How can his martial path fate matrix light spot be so strong? It actually destroyed the martial path fate matrix formation and the heavenly star hall. Dean Saint Soul coldly said, roaring in a low voice. His eyes were filled with anger. Chapter 2706. Divine Demon Forbid. Bien Hongnong was very agitated, or to be more precise, very horrified. Beads of cold sweat appeared on his forehead, and his body trembled slightly. He was on the verge of collapsing. Bien Hongnong, what's wrong with you? What did you find? Dean Saint Soul's face darkened when he saw Bien Hongnong's reaction, and he asked coldly. Impossible, this is absolutely impossible, that's just a legend, how could it be true? Bien Hongnong seemed not to hear Dean Saint Soul's words at this time, and he kept shaking his head with a horrified expression. Bien Hongnong, what's wrong with you? What nonsense are you babbling about? Dean Saint Soul was already very angry, and seeing Bien Hongnong's current behavior, it made him even angrier, and he shouted furiously. Bien Hongnong finally calmed down a little after being yelled at like this, but his whole body was already dripping with cold sweat, and his tailbone was cold. Bien Hongnong took 3 deep breaths, and finally calmed down a lot, and said in a deep voice, Lord Dean, I think that martial arts fate just now may be the legendary fate that divine demon forbid, and heaven and earth forbid. The fate that divine demon forbid, and heaven and earth forbid. Dean Saint Soul's eyes suddenly trembled, and his face clearly became much more gloomy. He asked, What does that mean? Dean Saint Soul did not have much research on martial arts fate, so he did not understand what Bien Hongnong was saying. Lord Dean, in martial arts fate, the fate that divine demon forbid, and heaven and earth forbid, has always been a legend. Bien Hongnong took a deep breath, and his expression slowly softened. He said, My teacher, who is also the previous pavilion master of Starry Sky Pavilion, once said, Divine demon heaven and earth control the universe. All the Daos in the world follow the principles of divine demon heaven and earth. But there is a kind of person that divine demon forbid, and heaven and earth forbid. Why? Dean Saint Soul frowned, and his face became slightly nervous. Looking closely, there were tiny beads of sweat on his forehead, and it was obvious that he was extremely nervous. He did not understand why there would be such a person in the world, that divine demon heaven and earth forbid. Because this kind of people. Bien Hongnong's eyes suddenly narrowed and shone brightly. His voice trembled and fear appeared on his face again. After hesitating for a long time, he said in a deep voice, Too powerful. Too powerful? Dean Saint Soul's expression was one of shock as he said in astonishment, Could it be that this type of person is even stronger than the fiend god world? They were supposed to be the most transcendent existences in the world. But there was actually a type of people that the heavens and earth could not tolerate, and it was because they were too powerful. Was this really too strange? The Saint Soul Dean's strength was already at the peak of the Saint Soul region, and he deeply felt the terror of the heaven and earth shackles. In the early stages of a martial artist's cultivation, it was more about breaking through oneself. In the later stages, it was more about breaking through the heavens and earth. The stronger a martial artist was, the more they could sense the strength of the shackles of heaven and earth. Therefore, Dean Saint Soul simply could not believe that there was an existence in this world that even the fiend gods and heaven and earth feared. Bien Hongnong's eyes trembled when he heard the words of the Saint Soul Dean. He nodded heavily and said, Teacher once said that the martial Tao fate of the fiend gods is the supreme of all martial Tao fate. They are born to be martial emperors. The strength of the martial Tao fate has already surpassed the control of the fiend god world. Therefore, even the fiend god world cannot restrain them, and their own existence is a threat to the fiend god world, to the world. This. Dean Saint Soul's face darkened when he heard Bien Hongnong's words, and he was momentarily speechless. Although he did not know much about the martial Tao fate, he knew that every person who had the martial Tao fate was in existence at the peak of the martial artist world. If the fiend god fate was the supreme of the martial Tao fate, then it was simply unimaginable how strong the martial talent of the possessor was. Dean, I know it's hard for you to accept for a moment. Bien Hongnong was much calmer now. He looked at the Saint Soul Dean solemnly and said, But you saw what happened just now with your own eyes. This person's martial Tao fate light spot is so powerful that it can be said to be shocking. Not only does the light spot far surpass the others, but even the martial Tao Fate array couldn't withstand it, and it eventually collapsed. The Saint Soul Dean frowned and fell into silence for a moment. At this moment, he thought of a person, the most monstrous person in the Saint Soul Academy, Nie Fenghua. Nie Fenghua's martial talent can be said to be unprecedented. It's something I've never seen in my life. The Saint Soul Dean's eyes flickered and his face darkened. But Nie Fenghua's martial Tao Fate is far from this fiend god Fate martialist. It's simply unimaginable how strong this person's martial talent is. Maybe I can use him to do something. Thinking of this, the Saint Soul Dean's eyes became a little sinister. Dean, what are you thinking about? Bien Hongnong noticed the strange expression on the Saint Soul Dean's face and could not help but frown. Nothing. The corner of the Saint Soul Dean's mouth twitched, and a sinister look flashed across his face. He then looked at Bien Hongnong and asked with a strange look, Bien Hongnong, how do you think we should deal with this person? This. Bien Hongnong was stunned. He had not thought of this question. The fiend god Fate was a person who was not accepted by heaven and earth. Logically speaking, such a person should be killed directly. But precisely because of this, it also showed how terrifying the fiend god Fate was. Therefore, Bien Hongnong fell into a moment of hesitation. He did not know how to deal with this person who was not accepted by the fiend god Fate. At this time, it was really the difference between heaven and earth. For this person who was not accepted by the fiend god Fate, he should either be killed directly, or he should be nurtured vigorously. He should use all the resources of the academy to let the fiend god Fate grow rapidly. Bien Hongnong, have you thought about it? Seeing that Bien Hongnong had not spoken, the Saint Soul Dean's eyes narrowed slightly. Dean, we must kill this person. Bien Hongnong hesitated for a moment, and finally gave his answer. He was a peaceful person, and did not like to do risky things. Indeed, nurturing a person who was not accepted by the fiend god Fate would definitely bring about a complete change to the entire Saint Soul Academy. Even the entire Saint Soul domain, and even the entire myriad domains, would change because of this person. However, the fiend god Fate was, after all, a person who was not accepted by heaven and earth, and represented a kind of existence that defied the will of heaven and earth. If he did not kill this person, it would mean that he was going against the will of heaven and earth. Bien Hongnong did not know what the consequences of going against heaven and earth would be, so he was not willing to take this risk. Should I kill him? At this time, the corners of the Saint Soul Dean's mouth hung a faint smile, and his expression was unfathomable. It was obvious that he was thinking about something, and also seemed to be brewing something. Dean, you wouldn't want to nurture this person, right? Bien Hongnong sensed that the Saint Soul Dean's expression was strange, and could not help but tremble as he asked in astonishment. Can't I? The Saint Soul Dean smiled faintly and asked in reply, since this person is the Lord of the Martial Way, his talent and potential are absolutely unimaginable. If we nurture him and let him return to the academy, there is nothing wrong with that, right? But he is, after all, a person who is not accepted by heaven and earth. Bien Hongnong said with a face of embarrassment, if we don't kill him, we will be going against heaven and earth. So what if we go against heaven and earth? The Saint Soul Dean smiled cold and said, the cultivation of a warrior is originally going against heaven and earth. It's just that our strength is too weak to really go against heaven and earth. At this time, we have encountered a person who is really going against heaven. If we kill him, wouldn't that be an idiotic act? Chapter 2707. Bien Hongnong looked at Dean Saint Soul and felt the passion in the latter's eyes. He couldn't help but frown and ask, Dean, have you really decided to keep this person? Dean Saint Soul's passionate eyes reminded Bien Hongnong of a scene from many years ago. At that time, an extremely talented warrior had appeared. Dean Saint Soul's passion was undisguised, and he had a strong desire for a talented warrior. That warrior, whom Dean Saint Soul had high hopes for, was named Nie Fenghua, but in the end, he became the biggest traitor of Saint Soul Academy. At this time, Dean Saint Soul showed the same expression again, and it was even more passionate than before. This made Bien Hongnong a little worried that history would repeat itself. Bien Hongnong, this time I know what I'm doing. Find that divine demon warrior as soon as possible. I'll wait for him in Saint Soul Hall. Dean Saint Soul frowned slightly and said in a deep voice. Then, his figure moved and he left. Bien Hongnong looked in the direction where Dean Saint Soul disappeared. His eyes were very gloomy, and he couldn't hide the worry in his eyes. Divine Demon Warrior was very strong. He was very clear that if he didn't kill this person, in the future, the entire Myriad domain would change because of this person. Looks like it's time to see Master, Bien Hongnong murmured after being silent for a long time. Then, his figure moved, and he went in the direction of Saint Soul Square. He decided to find the Divine Demon Warrior first, and then find his own master to consult him. At the same time, Saint Soul Square. At this time, the Saint Soul Square was in a complete mess. Everyone in the square gathered, and their eyes were focused on two people, Nie Tian and Tian Zhuowen. You've lost, brat. Tian Zhuowen taunted Nie Tian with an icy look in his eyes. I lost. Nie Tian frowned, and the corners of his mouth curled into a strange smile. He asked, I lost. Although Tian Zhuowen was a little uncertain in his heart, he appeared very strong on the surface. He said, the Saint Soul Stone Tablet tests warriors, and the red light column represents the strongest talent. You triggered the white light column, so didn't you lose? A white pillar of light, one light is split into 7 parts. Everyone saw the final scene. Everyone knew exactly how strong my desire for the Sacred Soul Tablet was. You said I lost, so I said you lost. Nie Tian smiled faintly, looking very calm. You. Tian Zhuowen's face sank. His eyes were filled with murderous intent as he shouted, Brat, are you trying to act shamelessly in front of this young master? Tian Zhuowen, I'm not the one who's acting shamelessly. It's you. Nie Tianling chuckled, his face gloomy. And at this moment, the surrounding crowd was stunned. Their expressions were very strange, and they were unsure of what to do. That silver-haired brat created a white pillar of light on the Saint Soul Stone Tablet. This is something that has never happened before. More importantly, the white pillar of light turned into a rainbow-colored ripple in the end. It was too shocking. Logically speaking, he should have one, right? Bullshit. The Sacred Soul Tablet's test had always been based on the scarlet light pillar being the strongest. The silver-haired kid's white light pillar was an accident. How can his talent be compared to young Master Tian Zhuowen's? A white pillar of light. I've never seen it before. Looks like we'll have to wait for someone from the academy to explain. The crowd discussed. Some supported Nie Tian, while others supported Tian Zhuowen. Everyone had different opinions. Teacher, at this time, aren't you going to say a few words? At this moment, Feng Qi's voice rang out. He looked at the Saint Soul Academy's black-clothed cultivator and asked. The black-clothed cultivator was stunned. His face was extremely ugly and he couldn't say a word. In fact, Feng Qi was not threatening him. He simply wanted the latter to stand up and say a few words of justice. In this situation, no matter how much they argued, there had to be an authoritative person to decide the winner. Unfortunately, the black-clothed cultivator was also at a loss. He didn't know what was going on either. He had supervised the Saint Soul test many times, but he had never seen anyone create a white pillar of light. In his heart, he was leaning towards Nie Tian's victory. However, his words didn't mean anything because he didn't know much about the Saint Soul Stone Tablet. The black-clothed cultivator had a helpless look on his face as he looked at the people from the academy nearby. However, those few cultivators all ran away and didn't dare to step forward. Everyone could see that Feng Qi's identity wasn't ordinary, and Tianjuan also had a powerful family backing him. At this time, if anyone stepped forward, wouldn't that be inviting trouble for themselves? Everyone, please calm down. I'll go invite the people from the Star Pavilion and let them explain everything. After thinking for a while, the black-clothed cultivator's gaze swept across the crowd, and he spoke in a deep voice. This matter involved too many people, so he didn't dare to make a rash decision. Hence, he could only invite the people from the Star Pavilion. As he finished speaking, the black-clothed cultivator moved and prepared to invite the people from the Star Pavilion. There's no need to go. However, at this time, a figure stood out and spoke coldly. His attitude was extremely arrogant. The crowd looked over and saw that the person who spoke was a young cultivator dressed in white. He had delicate features, but he gave off a feeling that he wasn't masculine enough and was full of yin qi. He's the core disciple of the Star Pavilion, Li Han. At this moment, someone recognized the white-clothed man and exclaimed, "You're from the Star Pavilion?" The black-clothed cultivator was stunned for a moment. Then, he looked at Li Han with an undisguised passion. He originally wanted to invite the people from the Star Pavilion. If the person in front of him was a disciple of the Star Pavilion, things would be much simpler. Yes. Li Han nodded his head slightly. His expression was extremely arrogant, and he didn't even look at the black-clothed cultivator. He said indifferently, "I am Li Han, one of the 3 core disciples of the Star Pavilion." When the black-clothed cultivator saw Li Han's attitude, he didn't get angry. Instead, he smiled apologetically and said, "So you're a core disciple of the Star Pavilion. Sorry for not recognizing you." The Star Pavilion had always been a mysterious existence. Furthermore, Li Han was a core disciple. Hence, his status was higher than the regular teachers in the college. "Student Li Han, since you're a disciple of the Star Pavilion, please explain to everyone what the white pillar of light was all about," the black-clothed cultivator said respectfully and carefully. QL11 Li Han smiled and took a step forward. His gloomy gaze swept across Nie Tian. He didn't say much and directly said, "You've lost." Nie Tian frowned. He was very unhappy with Li Han's arrogant attitude. He asked cold, "Based on what?" "Based on what I said." Li Han smiled cold. He glanced over and said, "My words are the proof. If I say you've lost, then you've lost." Nie Tian's eyes narrowed and his frown deepened. If this Li Han spoke nicely and explained to him, he might believe him. However, he couldn't accept the other party's attitude. "I'm sorry. Your words mean nothing to me." Nie Tianling laughed and said directly. Li Han's face suddenly darkened. He stared coldly at Nie Tian and said in a deep voice, "You stinking brat, what did you say?" This time, before Nie Tian could speak, Feng Qi walked over and said with a smile, "He said that your words are smellier than farts. Don't you understand?" Chapter 2708. Li Han felt that he was being provoked. He was enraged and released his killing intent. He was a core disciple of the Starry Sky Pavilion. Even the teachers in the academy had to respect him. But now, he was being insulted by 2 people who had not even entered the academy. How could he accept that? "I advise you not to make a move. Otherwise, you will be the one to suffer," Nie Tian said coldly as he sensed Li Han's killing intent. He had sensed that Li Han's strength was not high. He was just an ordinary warrior at the peak of the paramount god realm. In front of Nie Tian's strength, he would be able to be killed instantly. "You're courting death," Li Han roared angrily. He moved and attacked. Whoosh! Li Han's attack was ruthless and direct. An ear-piercing whistling sound came from the sky. A violent force condensed into a palm shadow in the air and pressed down on Nie Tian. "Huh!" Nie Tian felt the strong wind. He narrowed his eyes and shook his body. A sword aura rushed up to the sky. It was like a ferocious tiger coming out of the mountains or a black dragon raging in the sea. The terrifying aura was released like a landslide and a tsunami. Before the palm's shadow could get close to Nye Tian, it was shattered by the violent sword aura. Bang! In the next moment, before Li Han could even react, a muffled sound came from the sky. His body flew backward, and when he landed, he was unable to stand still and fell to the ground. There was a trace of blood at the corner of his mouth. His face was as pale as a sheet of paper. Everyone's eyes suddenly trembled, and they looked at Li Han on the ground with a look of horror. With so many people looking at her, Li Han's face turned pale and embarrassed. "QL 11-inch stinking brat, how dare you attack me?" Li Han stood up and glared at Nye Tian viciously as he roared. He had never thought that Nye Tian would dare to attack him. He was a core disciple of the Starry Sky Pavilion. His status in the Holy Soul Academy was very high. Not to mention ordinary disciples, even many teachers wouldn't dare to make a move on him. The Heavenly Star Pavilion was an extremely special existence in the Saint Soul Academy. It didn't specialize in martial Tao, but rather in martial Tao fate and the rules of heaven and earth. There were very few people who were talented in this aspect. Therefore, the disciples of the Heavenly Star Pavilion were a cut above the other disciples. In the entire Heavenly Star Pavilion, there were only 3 core disciples, and Li Han was one of them. Therefore, Li Han usually thought highly of himself. Now that he was humiliated and beaten up, how could he tolerate it? "So what if I attacked you?" However, Nye Tian's reaction was very calm. He looked directly at Li Han and said with a faint smile, "You dare to make the first move? Do you want me to be a wooden dummy? What an idiot!" "What did you say?" When Li Han heard Nye Tian calling him an idiot, his pupils suddenly dilated, and his eyeballs almost popped out. He had been in Saint Soul Academy for such a long time, besides his teacher, who dared to call him an idiot. "Idiot, are your ears stuffed with donkey hair?" This time, it wasn't Nye Tian who spoke, but Feng Qi. His tone was even more disdainful. He directly pointed at Li Han and said, "Brains are good things. Can't you bring them with you when you go out?" "You?" Li Han looked at Feng Qi and suddenly felt a dull fire accumulating in his chest. His face turned white and green, and finally, he was so angry that he spat out a mouthful of old blood. "Humph." Seeing this, Feng Qi curled his lips and sneered, "With this kind of magnanimity, you still dare to jump out and pretend to be a big shot. I really don't know what you're thinking. Some people's faces are really just rubbed over to be stepped on. If you don't step on them, you'll be embarrassed." This time, Li Han was really going crazy. He pointed at Feng Qi and opened his mouth wide, but not a single sound came out. At this moment, everyone was stunned. They stared dumbfoundedly at Nye Tian and Feng Qi. Their eyes seemed to be saying, "Are these 2 guys crazy?" Indeed, in everyone's eyes, Nye Tian and Feng Qi's current actions were no different from lunatics. Li Han was a core disciple, and Nye Tian and Feng Qi hadn't even entered the academy. The 2 of them humiliated Li Han in front of so many people. This was a huge taboo in the academy. "How dare you 2 insult a core disciple of the Star Pavilion?" At this moment, Tian Zhuowen jumped out and roared, "You 2 are provoking the Holy Soul Academy." At this moment, Tian Zhuowen jumped out and roared, "You 2 are provoking the Holy Soul Academy." How could they not see that Tian Zhuowen wanted to blow up the matter? After Tian Zhuowen's voice fell, the void shook for a moment. Then, more than 10 martial artists in black appeared in midair and directly surrounded Nye Tian and Feng Qi. Boom! More than 10 martial artists in black released a frightening pressure at the same time. Like a dark cloud, it descended on Nye Tian and Feng Qi. The 2 of them instantly felt the frightening pressure. They couldn't help but sink, and their faces were slightly flushed. Kill them for me!" Seeing this scene, Li Han roared like a lunatic. His eyes were as fierce as a wolf's, and he couldn't wait to tear Nye Tian and Feng Qi apart. "Provoking the Holy Soul Academy, you're courting death!" a martial artist roared. Then, his figure moved and he actually attacked. Almost at the same time, More than 10 martial artists in black also move. Obviously, they wanted to kill Nie Tian and Feng Qi on the spot. No. At this moment, the martial artist in black who was in charge of the Holy Soul test reacted immediately. His eyes trembled and he screamed. Those black-clothed people were very powerful. If they attacked together, they would definitely be able to kill Nie Tian and Feng Qi in an instant. But most importantly, Feng Qi was a member of the Feng family. Moreover, his position in the family was not low, and he was at least a direct descendant. If Feng Qi were to die in the Holy Soul Academy, the Feng family would definitely cause trouble for the Academy. The Feng family was so powerful that even the Holy Soul Academy would have to be wary of them. Unfortunately, it was already too late when the black-clothed martial artist opened his mouth. Boom! With more than 10 demi-saint elites attacking at the same time, an immeasurably vast power appeared. Like a colossal dragon, it dived straight down, its presence seemingly about to devour heaven and earth. Oh no! Nie Tian instantly felt the frightening pressure and cried out in shock, his expression changing. Stop! In that very moment, a low cry resounded. Then, a profound power appeared. It was extremely mysterious and endless like a spring breeze, silently dispelling the combined blow of the dozen demi-saint elites. Huh! The sudden turn of events made Nie Tian's eyes narrow as he looked towards a certain spot in the void, where an elderly martial artist was standing. What's going on? The crowd cried out in shock and looked towards the void as well. Their eyes were filled with shock and they could not say a word. The elderly martial artist who had appeared before them had a very unfamiliar face, and none of them actually recognized him. That old man seems a little familiar. Only Li Han's eyes narrowed a little as he thought to himself in puzzlement. Even so, he did not recognize who the person who had just appeared was. Under the gaze of countless eyes, the elderly martial artist's figure moved and landed directly on one of the Saint's Soul test platforms. Everyone was trembling, not even daring to breathe too loudly. The elderly martial artist's body was a little hunched, but his eyes were shining brightly. His gaze quickly swept past the crowd, as if he was looking for something. Everyone could not help lowering their heads when his gaze fell upon them, not daring to look him in the eye. Only a silver martial artist had a calm expression and a resolute gaze, not evading at all. Chapter 2709. Chapter 2709. Chapter 2709. Discipline him well, huh? Nie Tian's eyes narrowed and his expression changed. Although the old martial artist's voice wasn't loud, he heard it clearly. It seemed that the old martial artist was here for him. It's over. At the same time, little Fat Cat's terrified cry rang out. Its face froze, as though it had encountered something extremely terrifying. Fat, what's wrong? Nie Tian asked in a low voice after hearing Fat Cat's voice. Nie Tian, your martial destiny is very special. I'm afraid this old man's purpose isn't simple, Fat Cat said after calming down. Nie Tian's face darkened even more. He looked at the old martial artist with caution. The old martial artist stared at Nie Tian as if he wanted to eat Nie Tian alive. His expression was complicated. There was joy, shock, fear, and even killing intent in his eyes. This old martial artist was none other than the master of the Saint Soul Academy's Starry Sky Pavilion, Bien Hongnong. It's indeed the destiny of the gods and demons, Bien Hongnong said to himself after calming down a little. He then took a step forward and came to Nie Tian's side. Nie Tian's eyes narrowed. He was only a few meters away from Bien Hongnong. He was shocked by the latter's terrifying aura. He estimated that Bien Hongnong's strength was definitely at the pseudo-sage level. If Bien Hongnong attacked him now, he wouldn't be able to resist. Sir, what are you trying to do? Nie Tian forced himself to calm down and asked in a low voice. You can still be so calm in front of I. You are indeed not simple. Bien Hongnong said faintly as if he was talking to himself. He then looked at Nie Tian and said, Follow me. Go? Nie Tian was stunned and asked to where? Someone wants to see you, Bien Hongnong said in a low voice, and was about to leave with Nie Tian. I'm sorry, I can't leave yet. However, Nie Tian retreated without panicking and said, I still have things to do. Bien Hongnong's gaze tightened. He felt that Nie Tian was a little interesting. He suddenly laughed and asked, You have already completed the Saint Soul test. What else do you want? I made a bet with someone, Nie Tian said with a calm smile. The winner hasn't been decided yet. Bet? Bien Hongnong could not help but smile. Then, he looked at the black-clothed cultivator not far away and asked, What's going on? The black-clothed warrior didn't know who Bien Hongnong was, but he could see that Bien Hongnong was a student of Saint Soul Academy. Moreover, his status wasn't low, so he didn't dare hide anything. He told him about the bet between Nie Tian and Tian Zhuowen. So that's how it is. Bien Hongnong couldn't help but smile after listening. He said to Nie Tian directly, You win. I won? Nie Tian went blank for a moment, his face filled with astonishment. Bien Hongnong said it very casually, but very calmly. It didn't seem like he was teasing him. When the others heard Bien Hongnong's words, their faces changed and they began to discuss in low voices. Who is this old man? He looks like he has a big background. He said that the silver-haired kid won. Is he joking? This lord dared to act so brazenly. He must be a student of Saint Soul Academy. But it's strange. Why haven't I seen him before? He seems to be familiar with the Saint Soul test. Could he be someone from the Starry Sky Pavilion? Everyone was talking at once. They all had a strange look on their faces. Bien Hongnong was the master of the Starry Sky Pavilion. However, he hid in the Starry Sky Hall all year round and rarely went out. Therefore, there were very few people from Saint Soul Academy who had seen him. Some ordinary teachers and students could not possibly see him. Even Li Han, one of the 3 core disciples of the Starry Sky Pavilion, had only seen Bien Hongnong once. Therefore, he did not recognize him. Old thing, who do you think you are? How dare you say that he won? At this time, Tian Zhuowen suddenly opened his mouth. He looked at Bien Hongnong with a sinister face and shouted. Bien Hongnong's face suddenly sank when he heard Tian Zhuowen's voice. His old face trembled with anger. Everyone was stunned. They looked at Tian Zhuowen in astonishment. Nie Tian's mouth twitched. He said in his heart, Feng Qi was right. This guy really didn't bring his brain when he went out. Even a fool can see that this old man's identity is not simple. This guy still dares to shout like this. Isn't he courting death? You're from the Tian clan, right? Bien Hongnong suddenly turned around and stared coldly at Tian Zhuowen. Yes, so what? Tian Zhuowen felt the coldness in Bien Hongnong's eyes. He was so scared that his tongue spun. If he was given another chance, he absolutely would not dare to speak like that. If that's the case, then I will discipline you on behalf of Tian Yu. Bien Hongnong smiled cold. He swung his hand and an invisible force whistled out. Pa! Tian Zhuowen did not have time to react. Half of his face swelled up. There were several bright red finger marks. It was very eye-catching. You! Tian Zhuowen felt a burning pain on his face. His eyes trembled. He wanted to say something, but he held it back. When the crowd saw this, their eyes froze and they were extremely shocked. No one thought that Bien Hongnong would dare to slap Tian Zhuowen's face in front of so many people. Tian Zhuowen was a direct descendant of the Tian clan. His grandfather was the vice dean of the Holy Soul Academy. However, many people also noticed that Bien Hongnong directly shouted the name of Tian Zhuowen's grandfather, Tian Yu, without any hesitation. It could be seen that his status was very high. Pa. But Bien Hongnong did not stop. He slapped Tian Zhuowen more than 10 times. Tian Zhuowen's smiling face instantly turned into a bloody mess. Only then did Bien Hongnong stop. Impudent! Go back and ask Tian Yu what I, Bien Hongnong, am? Bien Hongnong growled in a cold voice. The anger on his face had not subsided. Bien Hongnong. Someone heard this name and was stunned. Their eyes trembled. Many people here had not seen Bien Hongnong before, but they had heard of this name. It was the name of the pavilion master of the Star Pavilion. He's the pavilion master of the Star Pavilion. In the next moment, someone reacted and shouted. This time, everyone was in an uproar. They looked at Bien Hongnong with shock and fear. No one thought that the old martial artist was actually Bien Hongnong. The Star Pavilion was a special existence in the Holy Soul Academy. Hence, the status of the pavilion master was not lower than the vice dean. In fact, he was even higher. Tian Zhuowen scolded Bien Hongnong in front of everyone. It was really a kick in the head. In the next moment, the expressions of the crowd became a little strange. They were guessing why Bien Hongnong suddenly appeared. In the next moment, everyone seemed to have thought of something, and their gazes all locked onto Nie Tian. Just now, Bien Hongnong had said that he was here because of Nie Tian. Everyone immediately understood that when Nie Tian was testing his saint soul just now, the commotion must have been too big and alerted Bien Hongnong. Let's go. Bien Hongnong ignored the others and looked at Nie Tian. Hold on. Nie Tian smiled faintly. He looked at Tian Zhuowen and said, Of course, I have to honor my bet with him. Hearing Nie Tian's words, the crowd finally reacted. Their eyes lit up and it was obvious that they wanted to watch the show. Since Bien Hongnong said that Nie Tian had won, the winner of this bet was obvious. Tian Zhuowen lost. Not only did he have to lose a divine array scroll, but he also had to shout, I'm a stupid pig 3 times in front of everyone. Most importantly, he had to bark 3 times like a dog when he saw Nie Tian in the future. Chapter 27:10. Unable to escape, Tian Zhuowen stared at Nie Tian. It was impossible to tell whether he was happy or angry. However, his eyes were filled with terrifying flames of fury, and his body was trembling slightly. Clearly, he was infuriated. Now that the outcome had been decided, there was no room for him to argue. He could give the scroll to Nie Tian, but he really did not want to do anything else. The scroll is for you. Tian Zhuowen endured the pain and threw the scroll to Nie Tian. Then, he turned around and was about to leave. Young Master Tian, are you leaving just like that? Nie Tianling sneered. You seem to have forgotten something. It was just a joke. How can you take it seriously? Tian Zhuowen paused and said in a low voice. A joke? Before Nie Tian could speak, Feng Qi stepped forward and smiled cold. Young Master Tian makes it sound so easy, but when we made the bet, it was not a joke. Then, Feng Qi stepped forward and stopped Tian Zhuowen. What do you want? Tian Zhuowen's eyes darkened and he said cold, If I don't scream, will you kill me? Humph. Feng Qi smiled cold and glanced at Tian Zhuowen. I won't kill you, but I will cripple you. You. Tian Zhuowen clenched his teeth and was speechless. Crippling him? What was the difference between that and killing him? Little brat from the Tian clan, your clan's old man can be considered a powerful expert. Could it be that you want to go back on your words in front of so many people? At this moment, Bien Hongnong spoke. His eyes were filled with a cold light as he spoke. Tian Zhuowen felt the oppressive coldness in Bien Hongnong's eyes. His body trembled and he staggered back a few steps, almost falling. Nie Tian looked at Tian Zhuowen and said with a faint smile, Hurry up. Don't let this lord wait too long. I'll talk. Tian Zhuowen's eyes darkened. He knew that he couldn't escape this time. He steeled his heart and looked at the crowd around him. He said in a low voice, I'm a stupid pig. His voice wasn't loud, but everyone heard it. Everyone's faces were tense. Clearly, they were trying to hold back their laughter. Young Master Tian, did you not eat? With such a low voice, who can hear you? Feng Qi smiled cold and said in an extremely provocative manner. You. Tian Zhuowen glared at Feng Qi as if he wanted to eat him alive. What me? You're the one who excreted shit. You have to eat it even if you have to crush your nose. Feng Qi smiled cold and said in a vulgar manner, I'll speak. Tian Zhuowen was completely enraged. He no longer had any scruples and shouted, I'm a stupid pig! I am a stupid pig! I'm a stupid pig! As if he had gone mad, he shouted 6 or 7 times before stopping. He stared at Feng Qi with bloodshot eyes and said cold, Are you satisfied now? It's all right. Feng Qi smiled plainly and said, But you're really stupid. I asked you to shout 3 times. Why did you shout so many times? Is primary school math taught by physical education teachers? When Tian Zhuowen heard Feng Qi's words, he was like a ferocious beast. His whole body trembled and he felt a dull fire in his chest. His whole body was about to explode. He stared at Feng Qi with a venomous look in his eyes. If looks could kill, Feng Qi would have died countless times. The crowd didn't know what Feng Qi was talking about, but it was very satisfying to hear. It was extremely sarcastic. Nie Tian looked at Feng Qi and couldn't help but shake his head and laugh. He laughed in his heart, this guy really can anger people to death. Young Master Tian, why are you still staring at me? Haven't you shouted enough? Do you want to do it a few more times? Feng Qi was very proud at this moment. The corner of his mouth raised in a provocative smile, and he raised his eyebrows. Young master. At this time, Tian Meng also walked over. He was quite frightened and said with a trembling voice, Brat, today's matter is not over. I, Tian Zhuowen, will not rest until the 2 of you are dead. Tian Zhuowen's eyes swept over Feng Qi and Nie Tian. He growled cold and then turned to Tian Meng and shouted, Let's go! After that, the 2 of them didn't stay and directly left. The crowd looked at Tian Zhuowen and Tian Meng's back. When the 2 of them were far away, they finally couldn't help but burst into laughter. Damn! At this time, Feng Qi seemed to have thought of something. He shouted and said, I forgot to ask young Master Tian to bark like a dog. Nie Tian looked at Feng Qi, speechless. At this time, Bien Hongnong looked at Nie Tian and said lightly, All right, you're done with your business. Let's go. Nie Tian frowned and looked around as if he was looking for someone, but he couldn't find it. He had mentioned Tian Zhuowen and the bet on purpose. On one hand, he wanted to embarrass Tian Zhuowen, and on the other hand, he wanted to buy time. Fat Cat said that Bien Hongnong didn't come with good intentions, so Nie Tian wanted to wait for Huairu to arrive. Unfortunately, Huairu didn't show up. It seems that I can't avoid this time. Nie Tian's eyes narrowed and he thought to himself. Seeing Nie Tian hesitate, Feng Qi walked over and asked with a faint smile, Sir, why are you looking for Nie Tian? Bien Hongnong glanced at Feng Qi and said directly, Brat from the Feng family, don't interfere in this matter. I think even the Feng family doesn't want to get into big trouble. Feng Qi frowned and his face was a little gloomy. Feng Qi, forget it. I'll go with him. Nie Tian didn't want to make things difficult for Feng Qi, so he smiled faintly and prepared to leave with Bien Hongnong. After Bien Hongnong appeared, he didn't show any killing intent to Nie Tian, which made the latter feel a little more at ease. Then, Nie Tian said something to Feng Qi and Jun Aoqing, then left with Bien Hongnong. Feng Qi looked at the direction where Nie Tian and Bien Hongnong disappeared and frowned. Is there a problem with Nie Tian's martial Dao life providence? Jun Aoqing looked worried, afraid that something would happen to Nie Tian. At this moment, in the void outside Saint Soul Square, a pair of eyes witnessed everything. The owner of this pair of eyes was none other than Huairu. At this moment, Huairu's expression was extremely ugly, or even extremely ugly. He began to suspect that he had made a mistake in bringing Nie Tian to the Saint Soul domain. He didn't expect Nie Tian to have the legendary fiend's celestial fate providence. If he had known this, he would never have brought Nie Tian here. Old man, you owed me a favor back then. It's time to return it, Huairu murmured after a long moment of thought. Then, His figure moved and disappeared into the void. He was worried about Nie Tion's safety, so he had to find someone to ensure Nie Tion's safety. He already had a suitable candidate in mind, so he went to look for that person. At the same time, Nie Tion and Bien Hongnong appeared in the void. Old Bien, who is it that wants to see me? Nie Tion already knew Bien Hongnong's identity. He frowned and couldn't help asking. Don't worry, you'll know when you enter the hall. Bien Hongnong smiled faintly and didn't answer Nie Tion directly. A moment later, the two arrived outside the Saint Soul Hall. What is this place? It's so grand. Nie Tion couldn't help but exclaim as he stared at the majestic hall in front of him. He had seen all kinds of halls, but the hall in front of him was the most majestic one he had ever seen. Moreover, the entire hall was enveloped in a huge formation, like an impregnable fortress. Bien Hongnong, you can leave now. At this moment, a deep voice was heard from the hall. Although it wasn't loud, it was filled with a majestic aura, like thunder in one's ears. Yes, Dean. Bien Hongnong bowed slightly, before his figure moved and he left. Dean. Nie Tion stood rooted to the ground, dumbfounded. Chapter 27:11. Despicable Dean. Suddenly knowing that the person who wanted to see him was the Dean of Saint Soul Academy, Nie Tion couldn't help but look a little nervous. He wasn't afraid of Dean Saint Soul, but he felt that, for someone of such status to want to see him, there must be something extraordinary. Plus, Fat Cat mentioned that his martial arts fate was very special, which made him even more worried. Come in. At this time, Dean Saint Soul's voice sounded again in the hall, mighty as before. Nie Tion's eyes focused slightly, regained his composure, and strode towards Saint Soul Hall. Since he was already here, and couldn't avoid it, he could only face it calmly. Entering Saint Soul Hall, Nie Tion felt a vast aura circulating in the air, extremely mysterious. He walked over step by step, and saw a tall and thin figure standing in the center of the hall. Although he wasn't burly, standing there, he was as heavy as a mountain, and as vast as the sea. Without a doubt, this person was the Dean of Saint Soul Academy. Dean. Nie Tion carefully walked over, bowed slightly, and spoke respectfully. What's your name? Dean Saint Soul spoke, but didn't turn around, and his voice was a little low. Nie Tion. Nie Tion nodded slightly and replied respectfully. Nie Tion. Dean Saint Soul's body trembled slightly, as if his emotions were fluctuating, and he emphasized the word Nie. Dean, is there a problem? Nie Tion frowned and couldn't help but ask. Nothing, your aura just reminded me of someone. Dean Saint Soul finally turned around, his eyes shining as he stared at Nie Tion. Although there was a smile hanging on the corner of his mouth, it was somewhat forced. May I ask, Dean, who do I remind you of? Nie Tion smiled faintly and asked calmly. A person who made me sad, there's no need to mention him. Dean Saint Soul squeezed out a smile, and said as if nothing had happened. Oh. Nie Tion nodded slightly, and didn't pursue the matter. Although Dean Saint Soul concealed it very well, Nie Tion could see that the former's heart fluctuated greatly. Presumably, that person must have a very ordinary meaning to Dean Saint Soul. At this moment, Dean Saint Soul's face was calm, but his heart was in turmoil. He sensed an even more powerful aura from Nie Tion, and this aura was very similar to Nie Fenghua's. Nie Tion, if I'm not mistaken, you should be the legendary fiend god Nascent Embryo. Dean Saint Soul looked at Nie Tion and secretly said in his heart, your relationship with Nie Fenghua is definitely not ordinary. It seems that I and the Nie clan are really fated. Nie Tion looked at Dean Saint Soul and saw that the latter was thinking about something. He was not in a hurry. He waited for Dean Saint Soul's eyes to calm down before he asked, Dean, what's the matter? Dean Saint Soul didn't answer Nie Tion's question. Instead, he asked with a faint smile, Nie Tion, you're not from the Sacred Soul region, are you? No. Nie Tion didn't hide it. He nodded slightly and said, I'm from the 9 regions. Oh, so you're from the 9 regions. Dean Saint Soul's eyes flickered, and then he smiled. A martialist from the 9 core regions. To have a peak paramount god force at such a young age, your talent is really not bad. Dean, you flatter me. Nye Tian nodded with a smile, neither servile nor overbearing. At this moment, Dean Saint Soul's heart was filled with apprehension. He's from the 9 regions just like Nye Fenghua, and the look in their eyes is very similar. Don't tell me they're father and son? Thinking of this, Dean Saint Soul's eyes narrowed, and he almost showed it. Nye Tian didn't know what Dean Saint Soul was thinking, so he couldn't help but feel a little impatient. Dean, let's get straight to the point. You didn't call me here just to have a heart-to-heart talk, did you? Dean Saint Soul's eyes narrowed slightly. Clearly, he hadn't expected Nye Tian to speak to him with such an attitude. However, he didn't get angry. Instead, he laughed and said, Nye Tian, to tell you the truth, your martial path fate test shows that you're very talented in the martial path. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that you're the #1 genius of the Sacred Soul Academy. Because of this, the Academy has decided to vigorously nurture you so that you can grow up quickly. Hearing Dean Saint Soul's words, Nye Tian wasn't happy. Instead, he became more cautious. He smiled and said, Dean, you don't need to call me here just for this. If Dean Saint Soul had taken a fancy to Nye Tian's talent and wanted to do his best to nurture him, he could have done it in secret. There was no need to say it out loud. Dean Saint Soul laughed when he heard Nye Tian's words. A strange look flashed in his eyes as he said, Nye Tian, you're very smart. Much smarter than I thought. Nye Tian knew that Dean Saint Soul didn't purely appreciate him. So he didn't bother being polite and said directly, Dean, you don't have to be so polite. Let's get straight to the point. Dean Saint Soul stared blankly for a moment. He hadn't expected Nye Tian to be so direct. He laughed and said, Nye Tian, your talent is very high. The Academy intends to nurture you. But the Academy must guarantee that you're absolutely loyal to the Academy. What do you mean? Nye Tian stared blankly for a moment, then immediately became cautious. What I mean is, no matter what happens, you must stand on the Academy's side. Dean Saint Soul's eyes became much colder. You have no right to refuse whatever the Academy wants you to do. You can only accept and carry it out. Can you do that? Nye Tian's face became incomparably gloomy when he heard Dean Saint Soul's words. He finally understood what Dean Saint Soul meant. He wanted to nurture him into a tool of the Academy. To put it bluntly, Dean Saint Soul wanted Nye Tian to be a sword, a dog at his beck and call. But it was a pity that Nye Tian didn't want to be controlled by anyone. I'm sorry, Dean, I can't do it. Without hesitation, Nye Tian said directly. He didn't need Dean Saint Soul's resources. But he had to control his own destiny. If the road under his feet wasn't what he wanted to walk, then what was the point of being strong? Dean Saint Soul's face instantly became unsightly when he heard Nye Tian's answer. His eyes were cold and gloomy, and a trace of murderous intent surged in them. Dean Saint Soul, can I go? Nye Tian didn't pay any attention to Dean Saint Soul's reaction, and said cold. Go! Dean Saint Soul sneered, his eyes locked on Nye Tian like a venomous wolf, and said cold, Nye Tian, you're a sharp blade. But, if this sharp blade can't be grasped in my hands, then I can only destroy it. And Nye Tian felt the chill from Dean Saint Soul's body. His eyes narrowed, and he asked in a low voice, You want to kill me? Not kill you, just threaten you. Dean Saint Soul didn't put on an act, and said, You're an intelligent person, I believe you can make a wise choice. Nye Tian's eyebrows furrowed as he fell silent. He didn't expect that the dignified Dean Saint Soul, a peak figure of the Saint Soul region, would be so despicable. Nye Tian, have you thought it through? Dean Saint Soul saw that Nye Tian didn't speak for a long time, and the corners of his mouth pulled up into a cold smile, and he said, As long as you're willing to let this Dean plant the Saint Soul curse mark on your body, you can grow into the sharpest sword of Saint Soul Academy in a very short time. Isn't the purpose of a warrior's cultivation to pursue stronger power? What are you still hesitating for? Dean Saint Soul threatened and enticed, using both carrot and stick. Nye Tian stood in the same place, like a block of ice. How could he not hear that the Saint Soul curse mark was a kind of curse to control people? Once his body was planted with the Saint Soul curse mark, he could only be at the mercy of Dean Saint Soul. Dean, what if I don't want? After a moment, Nye Tian opened his mouth, his eyes extremely firm, without the slightest fear. Chapter 27:12. Dean Saint Soul's eyes were filled with killing intent. The aura around his body instantly became ice-cold. His entire body was like a block of ice, releasing a bone-chilling aura. Nye Tian furrowed his brows. The coldness in the air made him feel slightly suffocated. Dean Saint Soul's strength was too terrifying. As long as he made a move, Nye Tian would definitely be killed on the spot. Nye Tian knew that the aura that Dean Saint Soul was releasing was actually a threat to force him to submit. In an instant, the atmosphere at the scene fell into an extremely stifling atmosphere. Nye Tian frowned, his expression was gloomy, and he did not say a word. Nye Tian, you have to think it through. Life and death are only between a single thought of yours. Dean Saint Soul thought that Nye Tian was hesitating. He spoke coldly, and there was a hint of temptation in his cold tone. What should I do? Nye Tian's brain was working quickly. Cold sweat had already seeped out from his back. In front of Dean Saint Soul, he had no way to fight back. If he resisted, only death would await him. It seemed that there was only one path in front of him, and that was to accept the Holy Soul curse. Nye Tian, the Holy Soul curse is indeed a method that I use to control you. However, this curse is very powerful. It will greatly benefit your strength. Dean Saint Soul spoke again. Nye Tian, don't be nervous. Let's take a look first. What exactly is the Holy Soul curse that this guy is talking about? At this moment, Fat Cat's voice rang out. There was not much panic in it. Instead, there was a hint of excitement in it. Isn't it just a curse? Is there a need to be so afraid? At the same time, the Ghost Emperor's voice rang out. It was extremely disdainful. When Nye Tian heard the voices of Fat Cat and the Ghost Emperor, his eyes flickered, and the corners of his mouth curled into a smile. He seemed to be a little too nervous, and overestimated Dean Saint Soul's curse. He had Fat Cat and the Ghost Emperor by his side, two almost omnipotent fellows. Did he still need to be afraid of a curse? With Fat Cat and the Ghost Emperor, was there any curse that could not be broken? Sir Dean, I accept the Holy Soul curse seal. At the thought of this, Nye Tian no longer hesitated and answered directly. At the same time, a strange light surged in his eyes as he said, however, as for whether the Holy Soul curse can control me, that's another matter. Of course. Seeing that Nye Tian agreed, Dean Saint Soul smiled faintly, and the look in his eyes was also very strange. He felt that Nye Tian must have thought too highly of himself and was young and frivolous. That was why he said those words just now. Before everyone accepted the Holy Soul curse, they felt that they could control the curse. However, in the end they were controlled by the curse instead. Even Nye Fenghua had not been able to escape the fate of being controlled by the Holy Soul curse. Later on, in order to break free from the control of the Sacred Soul curse mark, the price Nye Fenghua had to pay was unimaginable. Nye Tian, are you ready? Dean Saint Soul couldn't wait any longer and asked directly. Come, Nye Tian said with a faint smile. With that, he sat down cross-legged, and the aura in his body became calm. Very good. Dean Saint Soul smiled sinisterly. Then, he raised his hand and black runes kept surging out of his palm. They looked like black flames, but also like violent little black snakes, dancing crazily in the air. Nye Tian sensed a lustful, evil, and dark aura from the black runes. He couldn't help but narrow his eyes and frown. What a strange curse rune. Interesting. Little Fat Cat's voice rang out, but it had a hint of playfulness in it. It's indeed interesting. It looks like a very powerful curse rune. At the same time, the Ghost Emperor's voice was heard. Hearing their voices, Nie Tion's face darkened. He thought to himself, "Don't trick me." If the Fat Cat and the Ghost Emperor really couldn't see through the Holy Soul curse mark, then Nie Tion would be in trouble. "Pay attention, I'm going to start." At that moment Dean Saint Soul said coldly. He laughed and said, "What you're going to endure is the first-rank Holy Soul curse mark. You must endure it." As soon as his voice rang out, the countless black magical symbols suddenly became violent. They swirled madly in the air, and actually turned into a cloud of black smoke that directly enveloped Nie Tion. Boom! In that instant, Nie Tion felt a terrifying force coming at him, causing his body to sink. Immediately after, a tearing pain spread through his entire body. Ah! Nie Tion couldn't bear the sudden pain, and let out a miserable howl. Humph! Seeing this, Dean Saint Soul smiled and said, "Kid, enjoy the feeling of being corroded by the curse runes." Nie Tion furrowed his brows, and beads of sweat appeared on his forehead. In the next moment, he felt the runes that covered his body suddenly go berserk. They actually kept tearing his skin, trying to seep into his frontal martial body. It felt like he was being bitten by thousands of ants, and his skin was being torn apart bit by bit. In an instant, Nie Tion's body had countless tiny wounds, but no blood flowed out. The unimaginable pain almost made Nie Tion faint. His facial features were twisted together, and his entire face became hideous and terrifying, like a wild beast that was about to go berserk. He didn't expect the Holy Soul curse mark to be so terrifying. It was even more painful than when he was merging the 3 forbidden skills. "Kid, if you can't stand the pain, just scream." Humph! Dean Saint Soul's voice was heard. It was cold, full of mockery and schadenfreude. However, Nie Tion ignored him. Even though his skin was about to be torn apart, he still didn't cry out in pain. "I couldn't tell that you have quite a backbone." Dean Saint Soul smiled faintly, but there was unconcealable horror in his eyes. What Nie Tion was enduring was a first-stage Holy Soul curse mark, the weakest Holy Soul curse mark. However, even the weakest Holy Soul curse mark was unimaginably powerful. For an ordinary martial artist, a first-stage Holy Soul curse mark was enough to destroy a peak immortal state martial artist in an instant. However, Nie Tion only had the strength of a peak supreme god, yet he could withstand a first-stage Holy Soul curse mark. In fact, Dean Saint Soul had already thought it through. If Nie Tion was devoured by the first-stage Holy Soul curse mark, then he would die. It didn't matter anyway. If he didn't die, it proved that Nie Tion was indeed a heaven-defying person. If he was properly trained and controlled, he would be an invincible sword. Therefore, no matter what happened, Dean Saint Soul wouldn't lose out. From this, it could be seen that he didn't care about Nie Tion's life or death at all. All he cared about was whether he could obtain an obedient sword or not. Then, the curse runes became even more violent, constantly corroding Nie Tion's body. QL11 Nie Tion's entire body was already wrapped by the curse runes, completely unrecognizable. Those violent runes crazily drilled into Nie Tion's body, corroding and biting his body. Nie Tion endured the intense pain, but after a period of time, he found that the curse runes were slowly fusing with the meridians in his body, unexpectedly making his martial body a little stronger. Then, a moment later, the curse runes around Nie Tion's body completely fused with his martial body and disappeared. His whole body was covered with bloody wounds, but it soon returned to normal. Dean Saint Soul was dumbfounded watching from the side. He had never seen anyone absorb the Holy Soul curse mark so quickly. Even Nie Fenghua back then took an entire day to absorb the rank 1 Saint Soul curse mark. However, Nye Tian had only used half an hour to do so. Chapter 27:13. Above the Holy Soul Hall, after Nye Tian successfully absorbed the Holy Soul Curse Seal, he felt that his body had returned to normal. He took a deep breath and stood up. Nye Tian, very good. Dean Saint Soul looked at Nye Tian, his expression returned to normal, and said with a laugh, "Your martial body is much stronger than I thought." Nye Tian smiled faintly and did not speak. Nye Tian, remember, the Holy Soul Curse Seal in your body was planted by me. At this time Dean Saint Soul's face became gloomy and he said cold, "If you dare to disobey my order, I can kill you in an instant. I think you already know how terrifying those curse runes are. They have integrated with your limbs and meridians, and can directly tear your martial body. Dean, your threat is very good, but it's useless against me." Dean Saint Soul had just finished speaking when Nye Tian put on an impatient look and said directly, "If you have nothing else, I'm leaving." Dean Saint Soul's eyes darkened and his face turned ugly. Nye Tian's attitude at this time made him very unhappy. But he did not get angry and said, "Nye Tian, from now on, you are a disciple of the Holy Soul Academy, and the Academy will spare no resources to train you. I know, I'm leaving." Nye Tian was too lazy to listen to Dean Saint Soul's fart, and directly responded cold, and turned to leave. Wait a minute. Dean Saint Soul did not expect Nye Tian's attitude to be so cold, but he was still not angry, and just called out to Nye Tian, "Dean, is there anything else?" Nye Tian's figure paused, but he did not turn back. Dean Saint Soul frowned slightly, and threw out a token. Nye Tian took the token, and his eyes slightly focused, and he could not help but be stunned. QL11 This token was pure black chi, and at first glance it was not eye-catching, but if you carefully perceived, you would find that the token was surging with a layer of faint luster, which was extremely mysterious. The front of the token was engraved with the word Holy Spirit, and the back with the word Core. Nye Tian, this is the core token of the Academy. With this token, you can enter most places in the Academy. Dean Saint Soul said in a deep voice, "You have just joined the Academy. Although I gave you the core token, you are still an outer disciple. Understand?" "Thank you." Nye Tian nodded his head. Without hesitation, he walked out of the Holy Soul Hall. Dean Saint Soul looked at Nye Tian's figure with a somewhat gloomy expression. After a long while, a sinister smile appeared on the corner of his mouth and he murmured, "It seems that it won't be easy to completely control this brat." "Master." At this moment, another voice came from Dean Saint Soul. It was a completely different voice. "Bone Owl, what's wrong?" Dean Saint Soul narrowed his eyes and a black wooden box appeared on his palm. It was shrouded in black gas and emitted an extremely evil aura. The voice just now had come from the black wooden box. It seemed that there was a person living in the black wooden box. His name was Bone Owl. "Master, he has the God-fiend mandate. We are playing with fire if we use him." Bone Owl's voice sounded again. It was deep and husky, giving off an oppressive aura. "Playing with fire?" The corners of Dean Saint Soul's mouth twitched, but he laughed and said, "What we are going to do, I guess only the gods and demons can do it." "Yes," Bone Owl replied. After a moment of silence, he spoke again with a hint of worry in his voice. "Master, are you sure the Holy Soul Curse Seal can really control him?" "The Holy Soul Curse Seal is one of the 3 holy seals of my clan. Even if I'm not strong enough to release its true power, it shouldn't be a problem to control a peak paramount god," Dean Saint Soul said in a deep voice. Although he sounded confident, he was actually a little worried. The speed at which Nye Tian was absorbing the Holy Soul Curse Seal was the fastest he had ever seen. He was worried that Nye Tian wouldn't be able to withstand the Holy Soul Curse Seal. He didn't expect that Nye Tian would be able to absorb it in half an hour. "I hope everything goes well." Bone Owl's voice sounded, and then there was no more movement. The black wooden box disappeared from Dean Saint Soul's hand. Dean Saint Soul's eyes glowed with unconcealable passion. He was looking forward to the moment when Nye Tian would grow up. He couldn't stop what he wanted to do with Nye Tian. In order to do this, he had prepared for over 1,000,000 years, and no one could stop him. At the same time, Nye Tian walked out of the Holy Soul Hall and prepared to return to the Holy Soul Square. But not long after he stepped into the void, he sensed an aura. Nye Tian didn't panic. He just smiled and said, "Elder Hua, you're finally here. Nye Tian, are you okay?" Huairu's figure appeared and came to Nye Tian's side. His eyes kept looking at Nye Tian, as if he was afraid that something was missing. Huairu didn't notice anything strange about Nye Tian. He couldn't help but feel puzzled and asked, "Didn't the dean do anything to you?" "No, I didn't." With a faint smile, Nye Tian took out his core disciple's identity medallion and said, "Our dean gave me this identity medallion and said that he would do everything he could to help me." He didn't want Huairu to worry, so he lied. Huairu hadn't appeared before because he was afraid of Dean Saint Soul, Bien Hongnong, and the others. Therefore, even if Nye Tian told Huairu about the Holy Soul Curse Seal, the latter wouldn't be able to do anything and would only be troubled. Huairu was extremely puzzled. He thought to himself, although the dean looks virtuous and has the bearing of a master, his eyes hide a deep darkness. He is definitely not a simple person. He specifically met with Nye Tian at the Holy Soul Hall. He couldn't have just given the core token to Nye Tian. Nye Tian was definitely afraid that I would worry and hid something. Huairu guessed what Nye Tian was thinking, but he didn't expose him. He only said in a low voice, "Nye Tian, the dean is unfathomable. You must be careful when dealing with him in the future." "Understood." Nye Tian smiled and nodded. He said, "Elder Hua, tell me about the Holy Soul Academy. I just arrived here and don't know many things." "That's fine." Huairu nodded and said, "The Holy Soul Academy is built against the Holy Soul mountain range. It has a circumference of tens of thousands of kilometers and is divided into 5 areas: the Outer Court, the Inner Court, the Core Court, the Hidden Dragon Institute, and the Forbidden Realm. The people who live in the Outer Court are the Outer Court disciples, the Inner Court disciples are the Inner Court disciples, the Core Court disciples are the Core disciples, and the Hidden Dragon Institute disciples are the people on the Hidden Dragon ranking. Only certain people can enter the Forbidden Realm. Others are not allowed to enter. The Academy uses a point system to nurture disciples. As long as you complete certain missions for the Academy, you will be able to obtain a certain amount of points. The Academy's points can be exchanged for a few things, such as divine pills, divine tools, divine formations, martial techniques, and so on. If you have enough points, you can even exchange them for a Saint-Tier martial technique. Saint-Tier martial technique. When Nye Tian heard this, his eyes couldn't help but tremble and become slightly fervent. He already knew how precious Saint-Tier martial techniques were. Even a power like the Myriad Domains Guild only had a few incomplete scrolls of Saint-Tier martial technique. Chapter 27:14. Holy Soul Martial Pavilion, Change My Martial Skill? Nye Tian's face stiffened when he heard Huairu's words. Although he had come to the Sacred Soul region, he had no intention of changing his martial technique. "What? You don't want to change your martial technique?" Huairu frowned when he saw Nye Tian's reaction. "Elder Hua, the martial technique that I'm cultivating right now is known as the 9 Apex War God technique. I obtained it from a forbidden ground in the planar world. When I was cultivating it back then, I didn't know what grade it was." Nye Tian's expression was a little awkward as he said, "I've cultivated the 9 Extremes War God art for so long, but I've never thought of changing martial arts techniques." He was a nostalgic person. Anything that had accompanied him as he grew up, he would not abandon unless it was absolutely necessary. The grade of the 9 Apex War God art wasn't too high. However, it was extremely precious to Nye Tian. 9 Apex War God art? When Hua Iru heard Nie Tian's words, he couldn't help but be startled. His expression changed slightly as if he sensed something. He said, Nie Tian, don't move first. I want to check your martial technique. Nie Tian nodded. His body relaxed and he did not resist. Hua Iru sensed it with his divine sense. Like an invisible hand, it slowly swept past Nie Tian's martial body. After sensing Nie Tian's martial body, Hua Iru's face darkened and he fell into silence. Seeing Hua Iru's reaction, Nie Tian could not help but frown. He did not dare to disturb Hua Iru, and could only watch from the side. After a long time, Hua Iru's expression returned to normal, and he said in a deep voice, Nie Tian, the martial technique you practice is at the false deity grade. Pseudo-divine rank? Nie Tian was taken aback. He didn't quite understand what Hua Iru meant. Hua Iru glanced at Nie Tian and explained, pseudo-divine ranked martial techniques are very rare. It is a super heaven ranked martial technique. However, it has not reached the divine ranked, so it can only be called pseudo-divine rank. Although pseudo-divine rank martial techniques aren't as terrifying as divine rank martial techniques, they have an extremely great advantage, and that is that they're suitable for cultivation in both planes and realms. So that's how it is. Nie Tian nodded in realization. No wonder his cultivation speed was so fast in the planar world and also in the realms. Nie Tian, I feel that your 9 extremities war god art is very special. There seems to be something wrong with it, but I don't know what it is. At this moment, Hua Iru frowned and said in a deep voice. Nie Tian was also stunned. He didn't quite understand what Hua Iru meant. Nie Tian, I've seen a martial art manual in the Saint Soul Martial Pavilion before. It's also called the 9 Extremes War God Art. However, that 9 Extremes War God Art is a high-grade divine rank martial art. Hua Iru continued speaking with a puzzled expression. Even he himself was a little confused. How is that possible? Nie Tian was stunned for a moment. He said in astonishment, the same martial art manual can have 2 different grades? I also think it strange. Hua Iru frowned. He also had a puzzled expression. Elder Hua, you can't be mistaken, right? Nie Tian asked with a frown. He couldn't figure it out even after a long time. I can't be mistaken. Hua Iru was very certain. He said, it's definitely the 9 Extremities War God Art. I remember it very clearly. It's on the 3rd floor of the Saint Soul Martial Pavilion. This? Nie Tian frowned. He didn't know what was going on. Then, he suddenly thought of something and asked, Elder Hua, what kind of place is the Saint Soul Martial Pavilion? The Saint Soul Martial Pavilion is a pavilion in the Saint Soul Academy. There are many martial techniques, formation diagrams, pill recipes, and so on. Hua Iru nodded slightly and said, Can I go in? Nie Tian's eyes lit up as he asked. You have the core token on you. Of course you can. Hua Yuan nodded and said, You can enter the Saint Soul Martial Pavilion now and look for the 9 Extremities War God Art. Maybe you'll find something. Nie Tian nodded and was about to go there immediately. But then he thought of something and asked, Elder Hua, where are Feng Qi and Jun Aoqing now? They passed the Saint Soul test and triggered the Scarlet Light Pillar. They don't need to participate in the other tests. They should be arranged to enter the outer court now. Hua Iru said indifferently. Oh, that's good. Nie Tian nodded slightly. He didn't waste any more time and left in a flash. Hua Iru looked at Nie Tian and frowned. He said in his heart, For Nie Tian's safety, I have to find that guy as soon as possible. After bidding farewell to Hua Iru, Nie Tian went straight to the Saint Soul Martial Pavilion. He asked a few people, and used a total of half an hour to arrive at the Saint Soul Martial Pavilion. The Saint Soul Martial Pavilion was one of the most important places in the Saint Soul Academy. So it's a tall tower. Nie Tian looked at the Saint Soul Martial Pavilion in front of him, and said indifferently with a smile on his face. From the outside, The Saint Soul Martial Pavilion looked like a 9-story tower. There was a mysterious aura circulating around the tower, and the surrounding space was surging with an extremely strong aura of a formation. It was obvious that there was a formation protecting it. Nye Tian could feel that the space thousands of meters away from the Saint Soul Martial Pavilion was sealed by a formation. It was impossible for ordinary people to get close. He took a few steps closer to the Saint Soul Martial Pavilion. Then, the air shook slightly and 2 black figures appeared. They descended from the sky and blocked Nye Tian's way like 2 mountains. Nye Tian was hit by the 2's aura and was forced to retreat a few meters before he could stand still. After he stood still, he looked over. The 2 were both demi-saints. Kid, is the Saint Soul Martial Pavilion a place where you can enter? Cram. One of the black-clothed cultivators glanced at Nye Tian with extreme disdain. Then, he roared angrily, telling Nye Tian to leave. Not everyone could enter the Saint Soul Martial Pavilion. Only inner sect disciples and above could enter. Seeing that Nye Tian was only a peak paramount god martial artist, this person guessed that he must be an outer sect disciple and did not have the qualifications to enter the Saint Soul Martial Pavilion. Nye Tian frowned and did not say much. He took out his core disciple token and said in a deep voice, "Can I enter now?" When the 2 black-clad cultivators saw the token in Nye Tian's hand, they were both stunned and exclaimed, "How is this possible?" They never thought that Nye Tian would have a core disciple token in his hand. But Nye Tian was only a peak paramount god martial artist. How could he have a core disciple token? Could it be that he had some talent in other areas and was a core disciple? Not only did the Saint Soul Academy have martial arts cultivators, but there were also other cultivators such as divine alchemists, divine array masters, divine weapon masters, and people from the Heavenly Star Pavilion. Although these people were not strong in martial arts, they were accomplished in other areas and could become core disciples. There were hundreds of thousands of disciples in the Saint Soul Academy, but there were less than 1,000 core disciples. Therefore, every core disciple was very precious to the Academy. "Can I enter now?" Nye Tian asked again in a cold voice when he saw the 2 black-robed martial artists stunned. One of the black-robed martial artists came to his senses and quickly bowed, saying respectfully, "Sorry, fellow student. We were too rash." Then, the 2 of them retreated. Behind them, a gap opened up in the formation. Nye Tian ignored the 2 and stepped into the formation, walking towards the Saint Soul Martial Pavilion step by step. Who the hell is this kid? To be able to become a core disciple at such a young age, he is really not simple. The 2 martial artists looked at Nye Tian's back as one of them said in a deep voice, "If he is really a core disciple, then he is the youngest core disciple I have ever seen." The other person nodded with a shocked expression. At this moment, on the 3rd floor of the Saint Soul Martial Pavilion, a pair of eyes saw everything that happened. Chapter 27:15. To make trouble without reason. On the 3rd floor of the Saint Spirit Martial Pavilion, a woman in red stood with a strange smile on her face. She had seen the entire scene of Nye Tian entering the Saint Spirit Martial Pavilion, and she seemed to have developed a strong interest in Nye Tian. The woman in red had delicate facial features and was extremely beautiful, but her eyes were somewhat cold. Her red clothes were like a raging fire, making her look like a thorny rose that should not be approached. At that moment, a trace of green light flashed in her eyes. It flashed for a moment before disappearing. "Interesting guy, I'm very curious, why did you come to the Saint Spirit Martial Pavilion?" The woman in red murmured with a strange look in her eyes. Nye Tian did not know what was happening to the woman in red at this moment. He had just entered the Saint Spirit Martial Pavilion and was completely stunned by the scene in front of him. Everywhere he looked, there were all kinds of scrolls piled up like a mountain. One scroll after another was piled up there like a pile of waste. Nye Tian casually sensed that the lowest grade of martial arts scroll was Earth grade. Obviously, no one organized these scrolls at all, and they were just piled up like garbage. Earth-grade martial arts scroll, if placed in the plain world, would be a very sensational thing, but here it was just a piece of waste paper. Nie Tian shook his head regretfully and did not stay any longer, walking directly to the second floor. Compared to the first floor, the second floor was obviously much more tidy. On the rows of bookshelves, there were countless scrolls placed on them. Nie Tian sensed that these martial arts scrolls were all high-grade heaven-grade martial arts scrolls, so the treatment was naturally better. However, he still did not stay on the second floor, because his goal was the third floor. Huairu told him that the high-grade God-grade 9 War God technique was on the third floor. Then, Nie Tian stepped on the third floor and immediately felt a mysterious aura rushing towards him. He carefully sensed and found that this aura came from the scrolls of martial arts scrolls. The martial arts scrolls on the third floor were all God-grade scrolls. Nie Tian sensed that the outer bookshelves were filled with low-grade God-grade scrolls, the middle bookshelves were filled with mid-grade God-grade scrolls, and the innermost bookshelves were filled with high-grade God-grade scrolls. He didn't hesitate and walked straight in. There are so many divine-level scrolls here. Do I have to search them one by one? Nie Tian walked to the center of the innermost bookshelves and frowned. His expression was somewhat ugly. There were more than 1,000 scrolls on the bookshelves. If he were to scan them one by one, it would take a lot of time. Nie Tian, the auras of these scrolls are all mixed together. It's very difficult to distinguish them. It's better if you sense them one by one. At this moment, Fat Cat's voice sounded and gave Nie Tian a suggestion. Nie Tian's face was filled with black lines. In the end, he could only nod and decide to search slowly. Next, Nie Tian sensed one scroll after another. Although the progress was slow, he maintained his patience. But what he didn't know was that there was a pair of eyes staring at him from the shadows. This guy seems to be looking for a martial arts scroll. The woman in red frowned slightly and thought to herself, a peak paramount god warrior is quite ambitious. He's actually thinking about a high-grade divine-level scroll. Interesting. At this moment, the woman in red suddenly noticed that Nie Tian's expression had changed. His eyes were blazing as he stared fixedly at a martial arts scroll. It really is the 9-level war god art. Nie Tian looked at the scroll in front of him with a look of pleasant surprise. He carefully sensed the scroll in front of him. It really was the 9-level war god art. Even the aura was the same as the martial arts he cultivated, but the level was higher. It was a high-grade divine-level scroll. What's going on? Nie Tian had a puzzled look on his face. How could the same martial arts scroll have two different levels? Puzzled, he reached out to take the scroll. But right at this moment, a fair and tender little hand was one step ahead of him and landed on the martial arts scroll. Huh! Nie Tian was startled. He raised his head and saw a beautiful face on the other side of the bookshelf, looking at him with a smile. This face belonged to the woman in red who had been secretly observing him. Nie Tian was shocked to see the woman in red. He was now face to face with her, but he didn't know when she had approached him. What surprised him even more was that he couldn't sense the slightest bit of aura from the woman in red. It was as if the person standing in front of him wasn't a martial artist, but an ordinary person. How is this possible? Nie Tian cried out in alarm. He had never seen a martial artist who could conceal her aura so perfectly. The fact that the woman in red could approach him without him noticing was terrifying. "Student, I'm sorry, but I want this scroll." The red-robed woman looked at Nie Tian. Her red lips moving slightly as a hint of a smile appeared at the corner of her mouth. "You!" Nie Tian frowned and was speechless. He wasn't a fool. He had already guessed that the woman in red must have been secretly observing him for a long time. Seeing that he was interested in the 9-level war god technique, she took the initiative and wanted to take the scroll. "I got this scroll first, so I want it. Is there a problem?" The woman in red pursed her lips and revealed a cute smile. There was no need to mention how unsightly Nie Tian's face was. Since there's no problem, I'll take my leave. Seeing that Nie Tian didn't speak, the woman in red took the scroll and prepared to leave. Wait! At this time, Nie Tian roared and said cold, "You've been secretly observing me for so long and even stole the scroll. What do you want?" Huh? Seeing that Nie Tian was angry, the woman in red was surprised and said, "Student, don't talk nonsense. I wasn't secretly observing you, and I didn't steal your scroll. I got the scroll with my own ability." You! Nie Tian's face was gloomy like a volcano that was about to erupt. "What's wrong with me?" The woman in red laughed and looked at Nie Tian with innocent eyes. She said, "You wanted the scroll, but you didn't have the ability to get it. Can you blame others?" "Miss, please don't be unreasonable." Nie Tian took a deep breath and calmed down. He said in a deep voice, "I'm unreasonable? What a joke." The woman in red raised her eyebrows and said, "You obviously don't have the ability, but you want to blame it on me. I won't play with you anymore. See you next time." You! Nie Tian's face suddenly sank. He was accumulating his aura, but he found that his strength was suppressed. He realized that this was the Saint Spirit Martial Pavilion. How could martial artists be allowed to fight? However, he didn't really plan to attack. He just wanted to test the woman in red. However, the woman in red was very confident. She completely treated Nie Tian as air and turned to leave. Damn it! Nie Tian looked at the woman in red's back and roared in his heart, but he couldn't do anything. Nie Tian, quickly follow her. At this time, the fat cat's voice suddenly sounded. It seemed to be excited. Chapter 27:16. How dare you! The lady in red quickly walked to the first floor and realized that Nie Tian was following her. She turned around and smiled. "Student, why are you following me?" Nie Tian was stunned for a moment. With an awkward expression, he said, "The Saint Spirit Martial Pavilion doesn't belong to your family. I can go wherever I want. Why do you care?" The lady in red was surprised. She then smiled and said, "You look like a decent person. I didn't expect you to be so shameless." Nie Tian blushed slightly and said, "You were the one who started it." "Alright, whatever you say." The lady in red smiled again and said, "Follow me if you want. I don't mind having a bum by my side." Nie Tian's expression was extremely ugly. If it wasn't for the lady in red taking the art of war, he wouldn't be a bum. Then, the lady in red came to the exit of the first floor. She nodded slightly and said respectfully, "Elder Wu, I want this martial arts scroll." When Nie Tian saw this, he couldn't help but be stunned. This was because the lady in red was talking to an empty space. "Little girl C, since when did your C clan lack martial art scrolls?" But at this moment, an old voice was heard. Then, a figure in gray appeared. He walked forward step by step. His body was crooked, as if a gust of wind could blow him over. When Nie Tian saw the old figure, his expression froze. He didn't even see clearly how the old man appeared. The scene just now was like an illusion. Without a doubt, this old man was definitely a powerful cultivator. "Elder Wu, I Si Xiaoye, am not lacking in martial arts. This martial arts scroll is for a friend of mine." The lady in red, Si Xiaoye, smiled and said calmly, "Friend?" The old cultivator staggered over. He was startled at first. Then, he looked at Nie Tian and asked, "Is it this kid? Elder Wu, does he look like my friend?" Si Xiaoye smiled faintly and asked, "No." Elder Wu shook his head and said with a smile, "He looks more like your follower." "He's my little follower." Si Xiaoye giggled happily. Nie Tian was speechless at the conversation between the old and the young. Next, Si Xiaoye took out her token and handed it to Elder Wu. The 9 Extremes War God Art is a high-grade divine tier martial art. It requires 100 points to exchange for. Venerable Wu took Si Xiaoye's token and laughed. With a flick of his divine sense, he deducted the points from the token. When Ye Tian saw this scene, he could not help but be stunned. He then remembered that everything in Saint Soul Academy had to be redeemed with point. Every disciple of the academy had a medallion, which recorded everyone's score. Nye Tian also had a core token in his hand, but it was completely empty, without a single point. Hence, even if Si Xiaoye did not snatch the 9 Extremes War God Art, Nye Tian could not take it away. Alright, follower. Let's go. After Si Xiaoye settled everything, she smiled faintly and walked out of the Saint Soul Martial Pavilion. Nye Tian frowned but still followed Si Xiaoye. This silver-haired kid is not simple. Elder Wu looked at Nye Tian's back and sighed in his heart. He smiled and said, "To be able to gain the favor of Miss Si, how can he be an ordinary person?" Si Xiaoye and Nye Tian quickly walked out of the Saint Soul Martial Pavilion's area, and the two of them directly left. However, at this moment several figures appeared. It's Tian Zhuowen. Nye Tian was stunned. He saw clearly that Tian Zhuowen was among the few martial artists. Beside Tian Zhuowen, there were 2 other martial artists besides Tian Meng. Their auras were very strong and extremely fierce. At this moment, Tian Zhuowen also saw Nye Tian. His eyes darkened and he shouted, "It's you! You guys know each other?" Si Xiaoye's eyes lit up when she saw this scene. She actually had a gloating expression. "Stinking brat, I didn't expect you to not be stupid. You actually know to come to the Saint Soul Martial Pavilion." Tian Zhuowen walked over quickly and stared at Nye Tian. He smiled coldly and said, "But it's useless for you to come. You don't have a single point. You can only watch after entering the Saint Soul Martial Pavilion." But in the next moment, Tian Zhuowen seemed to have realized something and said in astonishment, "Wait, you just entered the academy. How can you enter the Saint Soul Martial Pavilion?" "That's my business. Why do you care?" With a faint smile, Nye Tian said, "Tian Zhuowen, you seem to have forgotten something now that I'm here, right?" Tian Zhuowen's face darkened to the point of dripping blood. Of course he knew that what Nye Tian was talking about was a bet between them. The rule of the bet was that whoever lost had to bark 3 times when they saw the winner in the future. "If I don't bark, what can you do?" Tian Zhuowen smiled cold and immediately acted like a rascal. "Yo!" But at this moment, a sneer was heard and a mocking voice was heard. "So the dignified young Master Tian likes to act like a rascal." Tian Zhuowen's face darkened. He looked behind him and saw a figure flying over. He was no stranger to the figure. It was Feng Qi. Feng Qi. Nye Tian saw that Feng Qi had arrived and the corner of his mouth couldn't help but raise as he exclaimed in surprise. He didn't expect that Feng Qi would also come to the Saint Soul Martial Pavilion. "Stinking brat, it's you!" Tian Zhuowen saw Feng Qi and his gaze turned fierce. His eyes seemed to be on fire. At this moment there were 2 people he hated the most. One was Nye Tian and the other was Feng Qi. And now these 2 people were in front of him. How could he not be angry? "Young Master Tian, I like to hear dogs bark. You can start." Feng Qi landed in a place not far from Nye Tian. With a playful look in his eyes, he looked at Tian Zhuowen and said with a provocative smile, "Bastard! You're courting death." Tian Zhuowen roared in anger. Then, he moved and attacked. Boom! With a slap, a terrifying aura was released from Tian Zhuowen's body. A violent force howled out and pressed down on Feng Qi. Feng Qi's eyes narrowed. Just as he was about to attack, he was shocked to find that the violent force suddenly shook in the air and disappeared. Huh! Feng Qi was stunned. He turned around and looked at the lady in red, Si Xiaoye, who was standing next to Nye Tian. The person who attacked just now was Si Xiaoye. "Stinking bitch, how dare you!" Tian Zhuowen reacted quickly. His gaze was cold and like 2 sharp blades. He locked onto Si Xiaoye. Si Xiaoye, on the other hand, had a calm expression on her face. Her lips curled into a gentle smile as she looked at Tian Zhuowen and said, You're the young master of the Tian clan, right? You're really bold. You even dare to hit a member of the Feng family. Feng clan? Tian Zhuowen was stunned. For a moment, he didn't react. He asked in surprise, which Feng clan? The Feng clan of the Myriad Domains Guild. Is that clear enough? Si Xiaoye smiled faintly. She looked at Tian Zhuowen as if she was looking at an idiot. You? Tian Zhuowen was so shocked that his eyes trembled. He looked at Feng Qi and said in shock, You're from the Feng clan? He had never imagined that Feng Qi was actually a member of the Feng family. If he had known Feng Qi's identity, he definitely wouldn't have dared to go against Feng Qi. Feng Qi frowned and ignored Tian Zhuowen. Instead, he looked at Si Xiaoye with a strange expression. His eyes seemed to be saying, Do we know each other? Si Xiaoye immediately recognized Feng Qi's identity. This was very strange. You're called Feng Qi, right? Si Xiaoye looked at Feng Qi and smiled warmly. My name is Si Xiaoye. Do you know who I am now? Chapter 27:17. Ben's fiancé. When Feng Qi heard Si Xiaoye's name, he froze. His eyes stared straight at Si Xiaoye, his mouth slightly opened, but he couldn't speak for a long time. Never in his wildest dreams did he imagine that he would meet his fiancé here. That's right. Si Xiaoye was Feng Qi's fiancé. When Feng Qi was young, he knew that he had an engagement, and the other party of the engagement was the eldest daughter of the Si clan, Si Xiaoye. However, he had never seen Si Xiaoye in his life, and he didn't even plan on fulfilling this engagement. He had his own thoughts. He had to make his own decisions about his marriage, even if it was his parents' orders. He was going to live for hundreds of thousands of years. If he met someone he didn't like, and the two of them stared at each other every day, wouldn't that be torture? Hundreds of thousands of years, not just 1 or 2 days. Just thinking about it was scary. But now that he had unexpectedly met Si Xiaoye, Feng Qi's thoughts seemed to have changed, and he suddenly felt that this engagement wasn't bad. Feng Qi, looking at you, you should know who I am. Si Xiaoye looked at Feng Qi, and the corners of her lips curled up. She smiled faintly and said, But don't think too much about it. That thing is just a piece of paper, I don't care about it. Feng Qi's face darkened when he heard Si Xiaoye's words. Of course, he knew that the piece of paper Si Xiaoye was talking about was their engagement. Now, Feng Qi saw it as a bigamous engagement, but Si Xiaoye didn't agree. Nie Tian looked at Feng Qi and Si Xiaoye, and when he saw their expressions, he couldn't help but frown. He could tell that this was the first time Feng Qi and Si Xiaoye met, but the relationship between the two was obviously not ordinary. Feng Qi was from the Feng clan, and the power behind him was unimaginable. Si Xiaoye didn't look like an ordinary person either, and she definitely came from a super-large clan. Young Master Feng, if there's nothing else, we'll take our leave. At this moment, Tian Zhuowen, who had been trembling in fear, spoke cautiously. At this moment, he finally understood why that teacher sided with Feng Qi in the Saint Soul Square. The Tian family was very influential in the Sacred Soul Domain, but that was only limited to the Sacred Soul Domain. The Feng family's influence was spread across tens of thousands of regions. It was not something that the Tian family could compare to. Now that Tian Zhuowen knew Feng Qi's identity, he naturally did not dare to offend the latter. After saying that, Tian Zhuowen led the few people behind him and prepared to leave quietly. Young Master Tian. However, at this moment Feng Qi's voice rang out and he said in a strange tone, You seem to have forgotten something, right? Tian Zhuowen's body froze, and his entire face fell. It was indescribable how ugly he looked. Of course, he knew that Feng Qi was talking about how to bark like a dog. However, if he really did bark like a dog now, wouldn't he have to bark like a dog every time he saw Nie Tian in the future? It didn't matter if there were only a few people now, but if there were a lot of people in the future, would he still have his face? Young Master Feng, it was just a joke. Don't take it too seriously, right? Tian Zhuowen turned to look at Feng Qi and said with an embarrassed expression, "All right, I won't take it seriously. You can leave." Feng Qi smiled faintly and said calmly, "Really?" Tian Zhuowen was stunned at first, and then he shouted in surprise. He didn't expect Feng Qi to be so easy to talk to. Of course. The corner of Feng Qi's mouth curled up into a cold smile, and he said, "But I hate people who go back on their words the most. If you don't bark like a dog today, don't blame me for adding you to my kill list." After saying that, he looked at Tian Zhuowen cold, as though he really wanted to kill him. Tian Zhuowen was stunned, and he was so shocked that he couldn't speak. Feng Qi's meaning was very clear. If he didn't bark like a dog, then the two of them would be masters until one of them died. "Tian Zhuowen, it's your honor to be my dog. You should feel happy. What are you hesitating for?" Feng Qi said again, very joking. "I bark." Tian Zhuowen frowned, and he suddenly made up his mind. His eyes swept across everyone one by one, and finally, he gathered his courage, opened his mouth and barked, "Woof, woof, woof." After barking 3 times, his face was flushed, but his eyes were burning as he looked at Feng Qi, as if to see if the latter was satisfied. "Very good." Feng Qi laughed and said, "Very nice barking. It doesn't sound like a wild dog, but a specially trained pug." Tian Zhuowen's face turned red, and he didn't want to stay any longer. He bowed and said, "Young Master Feng, can I go now?" Scram. Feng Qi waved his hand, looking very casual. Tian Zhuowen turned and left as if he had been granted amnesty. Nie Tian looked at Tian Zhuowen's back, and couldn't help but frown. He laughed bitterly in his heart and said, "Just how powerful is the Feng family, to be able to make Tian Zhuowen so afraid?" He already knew that Tian Zhuowen's grandfather was the vice dean of the Holy Soul Academy, so the Tian family should be very powerful. But it was very obvious that the Tian family and the Feng family weren't on the same level. Otherwise, Tian Zhuowen wouldn't be so servile in front of Feng Qi. The Feng family was really powerful. A dog that bullies the weak and fears the strong. "I should make you bark like a dog every day." Feng Qi looked at Tian Zhuowen's disappearing back and said with a faint smile, a proud expression on his face, "Young Master Feng is so impressive." At this moment, Si Xiaoya spoke. She looked at Feng Qi with a pair of beautiful eyes with some disdain, and said directly, "Aren't you relying on the power of the Feng family? If it wasn't for the Feng family behind you, would Tian Zhuowen lower his head to you? I'm afraid he would directly kill you." It seemed that Si Xiaoya saw Feng Qi as a young master that relied on the power of his family to bully others. Reincarnation is a technical job. Feng Qi didn't seem to care at all. He smiled proudly and looked at Si Xiaoya provocatively. "I reincarnated well. Are you not convinced?" Si Xiaoya frowned, evidently not expecting Feng Qi to be so shameless. But her expression immediately changed and she laughed coldly. "Young Master Feng, you're amazing. This lady is convinced, all right? Logically speaking, shouldn't it be this fiancé?" Feng Qi laughed mischievously, his eyes sizing up Si Xiaoya. His heart was very happy, and he was more and more satisfied with his own engagement. This fiancé? Nie Tian was stunned for a moment, but he reacted in the next moment. His eyes couldn't help but tremble. He could already tell that the relationship between Feng Qi and Si Xiaoya wasn't ordinary, but he didn't think that the two of them were engaged. "Feng Qi, don't talk nonsense." Si Xiaoya's face blushed and she panicked. She shouted, "This lady has already said that the engagement is just a piece of paper. This lady doesn't care about it at all." "Is that so?" Feng Qi smiled proudly. "Since Lady Xiaoya doesn't care about the engagement, then I'm just casually mentioning it. Why are you in such a hurry?" "You!" Si Xiaoya's face turned red from anger, and she couldn't speak. Nie Tian saw this scene and couldn't help but laugh. He was angered by Si Xiaoya just now, but Si Xiaoya was completely defeated in front of Feng Qi. One had to admit that everything had its vanquisher. Feng Qi and Si Xiaoye were the legendary quarrelsome lovers. Xiaoye, don't be angry. We still have a long way to go. Seeing that Si Xiaoye was angry, Feng Qi was even happier. His brows twitched as he spoke. Chapter 27:18. Scar of the Heavenly Dao Boom. Just as Si Xiaoye moved, a mysterious aura surged in the void and pounced towards Feng Qi like a dragon. So powerful! At this moment, Nie Tian finally sensed Si Xiaoye's true strength. His eyes trembled and he exclaimed in his heart. Si Xiaoye did not look strong. She even gave off a feeling of weakness. However, her strength had reached the half-saint realm. As tough as Nie Tian was, he couldn't help but tremble with fear after sensing Si Xiaoye's strength. Si Xiaoye was not very old. She seemed to be even younger than Feng Qi, however. She had the strength of a half-saint. It was terrifying. F***CK. Are you trying to murder your husband? Feng Qi screamed when he felt a violent force coming towards him. He moved and retreated thousands of meters away. Then, he leaped into the air. Rumble! When the violent force landed on the ground, it blasted out a crack that was thousands of meters long and stirred up a wave of dust that was more than 10 meters high. Si Xiaoye raised her head and stared at Feng Qi. Her eyes glowed with a green light. She said in a cold tone, Feng Qi, I will tear your mouth apart if you dare to scream again. She was just reminding Feng Qi she was not really going to attack him. However, if Feng Qi continued to pester her, she could not be blamed. All right, my dear wife. Your husband knows his mistake. Feng Qi was very happy and said with a smile. Bastard! How dare you scream again? Si Xiaoye frowned. Her beautiful eyes were filled with a cold aura. Miss Xiaoyu, I was wrong. It was my bad mouth. That's enough. Feng Qi shook his head and smiled bitterly. He landed on the ground and looked much more normal. At least you know what's good for you, Si Xiaoye said in a cold tone and ignored Feng Qi at this time. Nie Tian was very confused. In that instant, he saw something out of the ordinary. A strange green light flashed through Si Xiaoye's eyes. It seemed to be some kind of abnormal pupil. Si Xiaoye's aura could be concealed perfectly, and her perception was astonishing. Perhaps it had something to do with her eyes. Nie Tian, why are you and little you together? Feng Qi suddenly looked at Nie Tian and asked with a frown. Nie Tian laughed bitterly, and briefly explained what had happened in the Saint Soul Martial Pavilion. Xiao Yu, Nie Tian is my brother. Why don't you give him that martial manual? Feng Qi said to Si Xiaoye as his eyes sparkled. Shut up. Si Xiaoye didn't give Feng Qi any face. She scolded him cold and opened her palm. The 9 Extremes War God Art appeared in her palm, and she threw it to Nie Tian. You really gave it to me? Nie Tian caught the 9 Extremes War God Art and couldn't help but be stunned. Idiot, without me, would you be able to take it out? Si Xiaoye glared at Nie Tian and said cold. Nie Tian's mouth twitched. He was speechless. Although Si Xiaoye was fierce, she was right. Without her, Nie Tian couldn't have taken out the 9 Extremes War God Art. According to the rules of the Saint Soul Academy, everything in the Saint Soul Martial Pavilion had to be exchanged with points. Nie Tian didn't have any points at all. Nie Tian still remembered that Si Xiaoye spent 100 points to exchange for the 9 Extremes War God Art. He didn't know if 100 points was a lot or a little, but to be able to exchange for a high-grade divine rank martial art, it shouldn't be that easy to obtain. It was obvious that Si Xiaoye exchanged for the 9 Extremes War God Art for Nie Tian. What Nie Tian didn't understand was why Si Xiaoye would do this. Before he met Feng Qi, he and Si Xiaoye weren't related at all. A high-grade divine rank martial art was a generous gift. Si Xiaoye didn't give it away so easily because she had nothing better to do. Xiaoye, why are you so fierce? Feng Qi chuckled and interrupted. Shut up. Si Xiaoye scolded, then looked at Nie Tian with a dark gaze and said, Nie Tian, I'm giving you this martial art manual, so you owe me a favor. It's not too much, right? Nie Tian's face darkened. He couldn't say anything. He was still guessing that Si Xiaoye had ulterior motives when she gave him the martial art. The latter immediately said it out. Miss Xiaoye, I can owe you a favor. But I want to know, what do you want me to do? Nie Tian thought for a while and said solemnly. Don't worry. It's absolutely not something that goes against reason and heaven. Si Xiaoye replied indifferently. Then her beautiful eyes flickered. She suddenly transmitted over and said, It's regarding the holy soul curse mark in your body. And? When Nie Tian heard Si Xiaoye's words, his face suddenly darkened. He never thought that Si Xiaoye actually saw through the holy soul curse mark in his body. Wasn't Si Xiaoye's perception a little too strong? And the strangest thing was, how did Si Xiaoye know about the holy soul curse mark? Nie Tian, don't be nervous. Si Xiaoye thought that Nie Tian had his guard up against her. She frowned slightly and said, I'm not your enemy. Not now and not in the future. Nie Tian's brows were knitted tightly, his face taut. He really couldn't understand what Si Xiaoye was trying to do. I'm leaving. Si Xiaoye smiled faintly. Then, her figure moved and she directly left. Nie Tian looked at her back with a complicated expression on his face. He couldn't see Si Xiaoye at all. But in her eyes, he seemed to be transparent. At this time, Feng Qi came to Nie Tian's side, shook his head, and sighed. Marks of the heavenly Tao are indeed powerful. What? Nie Tian was stunned and looked at Feng Qi in shock. At this time, two exclamations sounded in Nie Tian's divine sense at the same time. It was Fat Cat and Ghost Emperor. Nie Tian's eyes narrowed and his face instantly stiffened. Fat Cat and Ghost Emperor exclaimed at the same time. They must have made an extraordinary discovery. I said that Si Xiaoye is a mark of the heavenly Tao. Feng Qi saw that Nie Tian was stunned and said with a faint smile. What do you mean by a mark of the heavenly Tao? Nie Tian frowned and asked in shock. Her eyes. Haven't you already sensed it? Her eyes are the legendary fourth other pupil, marks of the heavenly Tao. Feng Qi's lips curled up and he said calmly. The fourth other pupil, marks of the heavenly Tao. Nie Tian was stunned and couldn't react for a long time. This little girl is really scary. She's actually the legendary fourth odd pupil. After a while, little Fat Cat's voice rang out, filled with shock and awe. This emperor almost made a mistake. That Si Xiaoye really is a mark of the heavenly Tao. At almost the same time, Ghost Emperor also spoke, his illusory face extremely shocked. Nie Tian was stunned for a few seconds. His tense face finally relaxed and he forced himself to calm down. He looked at Feng Qi and asked, the fourth other pupil, marks of the heavenly Tao. What kind of other pupil is it? Chapter 27:19. Entering the outer courtyard, sense everything in the world. Nie Tian's eyes narrowed when he heard Feng Qi's words. It seemed that the perception of the marks of the heavenly Tao was very strong, and was somewhat similar to the holographic divine patterns. However, Feng Qi's understanding of the marks of the heavenly Tao was very limited, and could not provide much useful information. The marks of the heavenly Tao are rumored to be tears left behind by the heavenly Tao in the eyes of a cultivator, so they are also known as the tear of heaven. At this moment, Fat Cat's voice rang out. It is said that cultivators who possess the marks of the heavenly Tao can become a supreme martial artist. Nie Tian was stunned, and the shock in his heart could not be any greater. The marks of the heavenly Tao were too strange. They were actually tears left behind by the heavenly Tao. Heavens, were they really tears? The top 5 of the 10 great Khanate other pupils are all very mysterious. Very few people know the true power of these other pupils. Then, the Ghost Emperor's voice rang out. In the all-heaven sacred world, I have rarely seen cultivators with other pupils. The myriad domains are indeed very special, to have so many other pupils. Nie Tian's brows furrowed even more tightly when he heard the Ghost Emperor's words. It seemed that in the Ghost Emperor's eyes, the myriad domains were very different from other realms. However, he could also tell that even Fat Cat and the Ghost Emperor did not have much understanding of the marks of the heavenly Tao. At this moment, Nie Tian was not very interested in the marks of the heavenly Tao. He had already obtained the 9 ultimate war god technique, and the most important thing now was to study it properly. Feng Qi, are you going to the Saint Soul Martial Pavilion? Nie Tian became much colder, and asked Feng Qi just to take a look. Feng Qi smiled faintly. Jun Aoqing and I have already stayed in the outer courtyard. You should go over too. Someone will make arrangements for you. Alright, then I'll go back first. Nie Tian smiled faintly. He did not stay any longer, and headed towards the outer courtyard. Feng Qi also walked towards the Saint Soul Martial Pavilion. With Feng Qi's identity, even though he wasn't an inner disciple, it definitely wouldn't be a problem for him to enter the Saint Soul Martial Pavilion. A moment later, Nie Tian arrived at the outer court of Holy Spirit Academy. The so-called outer court was where the outer court disciples lived. The outer court is practically a city. Nie Tian exclaimed as he looked at the outer court. He estimated that the entire outer courtyard was like a medium-sized city. There were high walls and ramparts outside the city, and the entire outer courtyard was enveloped by a huge formation that constantly absorbed the divine and saint energy between the heavens and the earth. The sacred soul domain was a growing sacred world. Not only was the space filled with divine power, but there was also sacred power. However, the vast majority of people were unable to absorb saint energy, because the martial technique they cultivated determined that they were unable to absorb saint energy. Nie Tian landed on the ground and was about to enter the outer court. At that moment, 2 figures appeared and descended from the sky, blocking his path. Token, the 2 of them said coldly as they glanced at Nie Tian with disdain. Token? Nie Tian naturally knew that the 2 of them were talking about the Academy's token. He didn't say a word and immediately took out the core token in his hand. When the 2 of them saw the token in Nie Tian's hand, they were stunned. Immediately after, their expressions changed, and their eyes were filled with unconcealable shock. They never expected that the token Nie Tian took out was actually the core token. Student, you must have come to the wrong place. One of them had a strange expression, and his attitude took a 180-degree turn. He bowed slightly and said, "This is the core token. You should go to the core courtyard, not the outer court." The 2 of them were disciples of the Academy, and had stayed in the outer court for a long time. Of course, they knew that some monstrous talents could directly enter the inner court or even the core courtyard if they were talented enough. Although Nie Tian wasn't strong, he might have some talent in other aspects. I didn't come to the wrong place. Nie Tian replied indifferently and said, although the token in my hand is the core token, my current identity is an outer court disciple. This. The 2 of them froze, expressing their confusion. Student, please report your name. One of them was relatively calm. He took out a scroll and said respectfully, Nie Tian. Nie Tian said his name indifferently. Nie Tian. When the 2 of them heard this name, they exclaimed at the same time, and their expressions changed. You're the person who defeated Tian Zhuowen. One of them screamed and looked at Nie Tian in shock, as if he was looking at a monster. Nie Tian frowned. He didn't expect this news to spread so quickly. From the beginning to the end, he didn't reveal his name, so how did these people know? What Nie Tian didn't know was that after he defeated Tian Zhuowen in the Saint Soul test, Feng Qi worked very hard to promote him. Adding in the fact that he had been taken away by the master of the Heavenly Star Pavilion, his name had already spread throughout the entire outer court within a few hours. Even the disciples of the inner court and the core court had learned of his existence. Now that he announced his name, how could these 2 not be surprised? So you are Nie Tian, no wonder you can obtain the core token. The other person reacted, and looked at Nie Tian with a completely different expression. There was worship and fear in his eyes. "Can I go in now?" Nye Tian couldn't be bothered to talk nonsense with the two of them, and asked indifferently. "Yes, yes, of course you can." The two of them nodded like a rattle drum, and hurriedly moved aside to let Nye Tian enter. When Nye Tian entered the outer court, he immediately felt that the divine power in the space was much denser. He estimated that cultivating in such an environment was many times better than cultivating in the outside world. "Student Nye Tian, please come with us. Your place to stay has already been arranged." The two martial artists followed him and were very excited. They felt extremely honored to be able to lead the way for Nye Tian. Following the two, Nye Tian arrived at a small square courtyard. Although it wasn't big, it was very unique and secluded. Along the way, Nye Tian discovered that the entire outer court was filled with such small courtyards. It was obvious that they were specially built for outer sect disciples. "Student Nye Tian, you will stay in courtyard 1414. One of the martialists smiled respectfully and bowed slightly, indicating that Nye Tian could enter the courtyard. "May I ask if everyone has their own courtyard?" Nye Tian nodded slightly as he asked indifferently. "Yes." The martialist nodded and said, "The treatment of outer sect disciples can't be compared to that of inner court and core court disciples. You can only stay in such a small courtyard. It's inconvenient for student Nye Tian." Nye Tian smiled faintly and didn't say much. In his opinion, it was already very luxurious for one person to live in such a large courtyard. However, the outer court was large enough, so it was fine to be a little extravagant. The entire outer court was covered by a super-large array. To maintain the operation of the array, who knew how many spiritual materials were consumed every day? Therefore, it wasn't strange that every outer sect disciple had their own courtyard. "Student Nye Tian, you can rest first. We won't disturb you any further." The two of them were quite perceptive. They bowed and said a few words, then turned around and left. Nye Tian didn't care about the two of them and turned around to enter the courtyard. Chapter 27:20. Chapter 27:20. Chapter 27:20. Fighting to recruit a disciple. Curious, Nye Tian couldn't help but stop a person and ask, "Hey, did something happen up ahead? A few teachers from the inner court have come to the outer court and are recruiting disciples." That person glanced at Nye Tian and said hurriedly before running forward, "Recruiting disciples?" Nye Tian was stunned. He felt it was a little strange and hesitated whether he should go and take a look. After thinking for a while, he couldn't hold back his curiosity. His figure moved and he followed the crowd. After a while, Nye Tian came to a small courtyard and saw three middle-aged martial artists standing outside the small courtyard as if they were waiting for someone to appear. These should be the teachers who are recruiting disciples. Nye Tian used his divine sense to sense and found that these three middle-aged martial artists were very strong. They were actually pseudo-sacred powerhouses. To be able to become teachers of the inner court, their strength naturally wouldn't be weak. "Liangzhen, don't fight with me. This disciple is mine for sure," the white-robed cultivator said as he looked at a short and fat cultivator. "Yu Lian, don't flatter yourself. The little girl in the courtyard is my disciple." Liangzhen smiled cold and said confidently with his arms crossed in front of his chest, "You two fellows, you still haven't woken up, right? That little girl's talent is so good. Wouldn't handing her over to you be destroying your own future?" The only female teacher, by Ruozhu, spoke, looking at Liangzhen and Yu Lian with disdain. The onlookers were puzzled when they saw the three people fighting so fiercely that they didn't even hesitate to slander each other. They didn't know who was in the small courtyard in front of them to be so favored by the three teachers of the inner court. "Three teachers, please leave. I don't need a teacher." At this time, a clear and sweet voice came from the small courtyard and resounded in everyone's ears. Hearing this voice, Nye Tian couldn't help but furrow his brows in astonishment. He was too familiar with this voice. It was none other than Jun Aoqing. He didn't expect that the person who attracted the 3 teachers of the inner court to recruit a disciple was actually June Ouching. However, it wasn't strange when he thought about it. After all, June Ouching was the person who stimulated the Sacred Soul Tablet's red light pillar. Little girl, whether you want to be a disciple or not, you have to come out and let us meet. Yu Lian frowned and shouted. That's right, little girl. The 3 of us are teachers of the inner academy after all. It's not good for you to just let us stand here. The short fatty Liang Zhen laughed and shouted loudly. You two shut up. My disciple doesn't want to come out. Do you want to force her to come out? Bai Ruozhu was even more straightforward, directly assuming the identity of June Ouching's teacher. Seeing this scene, Nie Tian could not help but find it funny. It seemed that these 3 guys really wanted to take June Ouching as their disciple. Seeing this, Tian couldn't help but feel a little funny. It seems that these 3 people really want to take June Tian as disciple. Little girl, hurry up and come out. With our status, it would not be good if we were to barge into your little courtyard. Liang Zhen was a little impatient from waiting and shouted loudly. Everyone also had an attitude of watching a good show and began to discuss one after another. Who is this person? She is so arrogant. 3 teachers of the inner court are here, but she still refuses to come out to meet them. I think she is too weak and doesn't have the face to meet people. Yes. Whether she is a phoenix or a sparrow, she has to come out and let everyone see her. At this time, someone looked at the 3 teachers and shouted, Teachers, the people inside don't want to be a disciple, but I want to be one. Take me as a disciple. Yes, yes. Take me as a disciple. I'm willing to do anything. The others echoed. Some were jeering, while others really wanted to be a disciple. All of you, shut up. Liang Zhen was originally very anxious. When he heard the voices of the crowd, he shouted angrily. A formless sound wave spread out, and the crowd fell down like waves. This short fatty is so strong. When Nie Tian saw this scene, his eyes narrowed and he exclaimed in his heart. Even though the surrounding people present couldn't be considered to be strong, merely a furious roar from Liang Zhen was able to cause everyone to fall down in unison, and the formidableness of his strength was obvious. At this time, Nie Tian did not want to watch anymore. He stepped out and shouted with a faint smile, Ao Qing, come out. Brat, who are you? Liang Zhen frowned and his face suddenly sank. He growled, We are taking disciples. What does it have to do with you? Why are you standing out? Nie Tian looked at Liang Zhen and his face sank. He said loudly, The disciple you want to take is my woman. Your woman? Liang Zhen was stunned. He did not expect Nie Tian to say such words in public. The crowd was also stunned. They looked at Nie Tian in disbelief. Nie Tian. At this time, just as Nie Tian's voice fell, a clear and sweet voice sounded. Then, June Ouching's figure appeared and directly landed next to Nie Tian. Ao Qing, are you okay? Nie Tian smiled faintly and looked at June Ouching dotingly. I'm fine. June Ouching nodded slightly. There was a touch of redness on her face. She shyly lowered her head. She heard what Nie Tian said just now. She did not expect Nie Tian to say this. So it's a young couple. Bai Ruozhu saw this scene and laughed. Then, she said, June Ouching, you triggered a red light beam in the Saint Soul test. In order not to waste your talent, we specially came here to take you as a disciple. I'm not the only one who triggered the red light beam. Why are you looking for me? As soon as Bai Ruozhu's voice fell, June Ouching spoke impatiently. This. Bai Ruozhu was stunned for a moment and was speechless. June Ouching, you're not the only one who triggered the red light beam. It's just that we can't take anyone else as a disciple. At this time, Yu Lian, who had been silent all this time, spoke bluntly. Nie Tian was stunned for a moment. Then, he immediately understood. In addition to Bai Ruozhu, Feng Qi and Tian Zhuowen also triggered the red light beam. But these 2 people had powerful families behind them. Of course, they couldn't take anyone as their master. Only June Ouching, with a simple identity, could take anyone as her master. It was obvious that Bai Ruozhu and the other two had done some research before coming here to accept disciples. I'm sorry, I don't want to take anyone as my master. June Ouching frowned and said coldly. This. As soon as her voice fell, everyone present sucked in a breath of cold air. Bai Ruozhu and the others were all teachers of the inner courtyard. Their strength was very strong. In the entire Saint Soul Academy, there were countless people who wanted to take them as their disciples. Now that the three of them had come and wanted to take June Ouching as their disciple, the latter was unexpectedly unwilling. June Ouching, do you know how many people in Saint Soul Academy kneel and cry to take us as their master? Liangzhen frowned and seemed a little unhappy. I'm sorry, I'm not one of those people who kneel and cry to take us as their master. Please leave. June Ouching's eyes were cold as she directly said. June Ouching, don't push your luck. Liang Zhen was a little angry after being rejected like this. His eyes were gloomy as he spoke. To think that he, a dignified third-step saint, had to lower himself to take a disciple. But the other side was actually disdainful. How could he accept this? The ones who push their luck are you. I'm going back. June Ouching replied coldly. Then, she pulled Nye Tian and walked towards the small courtyard. Go back? Liang Zhen sneered. Since you've walked out, if you don't take me as your master, don't even think about going back. Chapter 27-21. Chapter 27-21. Chapter 27-21 Too naive. Boom! An invisible pressure like a giant hand crashed down and the void sank. Nye Tian and June Ouching's bodies sank at the same time, and immediately felt as if their bodies were firmly grasped by an invisible giant hand, making them unable to move at all. Damn it! Nye Tian's face flushed red and he growled. He wanted to operate his Yuan meridians, but found that his 9 dragon meridians were firmly suppressed. June Ouching's little face was even more red, and she was obviously very uncomfortable. The sudden scene caused everyone to gasp, and they looked at Liang Zhen in disbelief. No one had expected that Liang Zhen would actually attack Nye Tian and June Ouching in front of so many people. Liang Zhen was a pseudo-sage expert and a teacher of the academy, but he attacked 2 students who had just entered the academy. It was really beneath his status. Little girl, now that you've seen my strength, do you want to acknowledge me as your master? Liang Zhen spoke loudly, and his tone carried a trace of complacency. It turned out that he wanted to show his strength and prove himself to June Ouching. T strength. Liang Zhen's voice just fell, Nye Tian roared, and then his body shook, and a violent aura soared into the sky. The air suddenly shook, and the invisible pressure directly collapsed. Liang Zhen suffered the recoil, and his body swayed slightly. And Nye Tian suddenly retreated a few steps, and a mouthful of blood sprayed out, and his face became slightly pale. Everyone's eyes trembled violently, and they looked at Nye Tian dumbfoundedly, completely unable to believe their eyes. Nye Tian actually directly broke through Liang Zhen's pressure. One must know that Liang Zhen was a pseudo-sage expert. How is this possible? Liang Zhen steadied his body, and his fat face was both surprised and horrified. Never in his wildest dreams had he expected that Nye Tian would be able to break through his pressure. He hadn't unleashed his true might just now, but it was enough to crush peak god realm experts. And Nye Tian was only a peak paramount god, so how could he possibly have broken free? This boy is very strange. Yu Lian and Bai Ruozhu were also startled at the same time, crying out in alarm. Ao Qing, let's go. Nye Tian did not pay attention to the others. He said indifferently and prepared to enter the small courtyard. You want to leave? Not so easy. Liang Zhen's eyes darkened, and he immediately reacted. He took a step forward, and an even more violent pressure was emitted from his body. Like a raging wave, it pressed towards Nie Tian and Jun Ouching. Boom! Nie Tian and Jun Ouching felt the air sink, and a terrifying pressure came from all directions, causing their bodies to tense up. This time, Liang Zhen utilized an even more formidable pressure. Bastard! Nie Tian roared, his eyes bloodshot. He didn't expect that a dignified academy teacher would be so shameless. Beside him, Bai Ruozhu seemed to want to make a move, but was stopped by Yu Lian. Let's see how capable this silver-haired boy is first. Yu Lian transmitted his voice to Bai Ruozhu, and said in a deep voice. Bai Ruozhu hesitated for a moment, but finally nodded. Liang Zhen's face darkened, and the corner of his mouth rose into a cold smile, and he said in a deep voice, "Boy, today I will make both of you worship me as your master." Then, his aura suddenly increased again, and it was incomparably violent. Feeling the terrifying pressure, Nie Tian's eyes suddenly darkened, and his gaze became incomparably ferocious, like that of a wild beast. At this moment, Jun Ouching's body suddenly trembled, and she coughed up a mouthful of blood. Her martial body was far from Nie Tian's, and even though Nie Tian helped her share most of the pressure, she still couldn't bear it. "Kneel down and worship me as your master." At this moment, Liang Zhen roared again, and the terrifying pressure rose again, pressing down on Nie Tian and Jun Ouching, and he actually wanted the two of them to kneel down. This is too despicable. When the crowd saw this scene, they all spoke up, and their gazes towards Liang Zhen were filled with anger. As a teacher, Liang Zhen actually forced Nie Tian and Jun Ouching to worship him as their master in front of so many people. It was really too shameless. "Even if I die, I won't worship a scum like you as my master." Nie Tian roared in a low voice, his body was straight like a mountain, and he forcefully resisted the pressure in the air. But blood started to flow out from the corner of his mouth, and his martial body had already been squeezed to the limit. At this moment, he released the power of the stars, and helped Jun Ouching share a large portion of the pressure. "Stinking brat, I want to see how hard your bones are." At this moment, Liang Zhen was also completely infuriated, and with a wild roar, he actually wanted to completely release his pressure. "Liang Zhen, quickly stop." Bai Ruozhu felt that Liang Zhen's aura was not right, and she shouted delicately, and then her figure moved, and she took a step out, and the aura around her was wild as she charged towards Liang Zhen. Bang! In the air, two terrifying auras collided, and suddenly gave out a muffled explosion, and collapsed at the same time. Nie Tian and Jun Ouching felt the pressure instantly disappear, and their figures sank slightly, and they retreated a few steps before they could stabilize their bodies. "Bai Ruozhu, what are you doing?" On the other side, Liang Zhen was forced to retreat several meters, and after stabilizing his body, he looked cold at Bai Ruozhu and roared in a deep voice. "Liang Zhen, are you crazy? If you continue to attack, you will kill them." Bai Ruozhu's black brows knitted tightly, and she said cold, "Since Jun Ouching is not willing to worship as a master, let's leave." As she spoke, she turned around and prepared to leave. But Liang Zhen and Yu Lian were like wooden stakes, not moving at all. Obviously, the two of them were not willing to give up. "Brat, I'll give you one more chance. Will you worship as a master or not?" Liang Zhen took a step forward, and a pair of cold eyes stared at Nie Tian. "Worship your mother." Nie Tian was completely enraged, and his eyes were as fierce as a wild beast, and he growled, "Aren't you relying on your strength? If you and I were martial artists of the same realm, would you still dare to force us like this? Brat, you've angered me." Liang Zhen's face sank, and the corner of his mouth raised into a cold smile. "This brat, you're too naive. In this world, strength will always be the greatest authority." Yu Lian also sneered and said, "Our strength is stronger than yours, so you can only listen to us. Is that so?" Nie Tianling laughed and said, "What if I don't listen?" Humph. Liang Zhen smiled cold, and a hint of killing intent flashed in his eyes and said, "Today you have to be obedient whether you want to or not." Nie Tian's eyes focused, and he suddenly understood something. He originally thought that these three people came to sincerely take him as a disciple, but now it seemed that his thinking was too simple. You have to be obedient even if you don't want to. These words are so arrogant. Just at this moment, an aged voice resounded, and then a figure slowly walked out from the crowd, and came to Nie Tian's side. Nie Tian looked at the old man beside him, and his face changed slightly. He wanted to sense the old man beside him, but he suddenly felt that his divine sense seemed to have fallen into a bottomless abyss, and he almost fell. "Brat, you're not bad." The old man smiled faintly as he looked at Nie Tian. Nie Tian's face sank and he was dumbstruck, and he said in his heart, "This old man's strength is absolutely terrifyingly high. You're senior Situ." And at this moment Liang Zhen and the other two looked at the old man in front of them, and they were all shocked, and their faces were filled with disbelief. They never thought that one of the three elders of the Holy Soul Academy, Situ Bai, would appear out of nowhere. The old man in front of them was called Situ Bai, and he was one of the three elders of the Holy Soul Academy. He was a rare expert of the Holy Soul Academy, and his position in the Holy Soul Academy was comparable to the dean.